Welcome viewers! You can see here that I have the two canonical ships of the show Avatar: The Last Airbender, Kataang and Mako, contrasted with the one pairing that should have been Zutara. I can see some of you already need a little bit more convincing. Don't worry, bear with me. As you all know, the goal of Sneezy Reviews is to always draw meaning through deep, complex analysis. So let's take a closer look at these ships for a moment, shall we? Now, as you can see from the ship names, Zutara is a bit of a mishmash of Zuko and Katara's names. We get the Zu from Zuko and the Tara from Katara, but neither character gets to dominate here. This is a very even playing field, very fair, very woke. Whereas, were we to compare to Kataang and Mako, we can see that the entirety of Aang's name and Mai's name is contained within these ship names. Katara and Zuko are enveloped, overshadowed, practically abandoned. As you can see, one ship is a healthy, balanced, equal dynamic, whereas the others are simply one-sided, asymmetrical garbage, really. I think the evidence just speaks for itself, truly. So there you have it, Zutara forever. Thank you for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time at Sneezy Reviews. Bye!
Okay. In all seriousness, this video is going to have a very different tone to my last video on this subject, which was basically an analysis of the general appeal of Kataang versus Zutara, and I really tried my best not to offend anyone with that take. I did this by focusing mainly on the overall structure and function of the two pairings, comparing them to other similar pairings in the media, and basically talking about what made each pairing likable to each ship. Now, I still stand by that take. I think that whatever ship you ship, or at least whatever ship you enjoy shipping, probably says more about your personal taste in romance arcs than anything else. However, for many shippers, the debate between Zutara and Kataang does go a bit deeper than that, because there's a difference between liking a ship and thinking that ship should have been canon. And the reasons for wanting a ship to be canon range widely, from I thought they were really cute together and I really like their dynamic, to I think their love story would enhance the overall plot in some way, to, well, they showed canonical interest in each other, so why are we even arguing about this? And, you know, change those sentences to negative statements for your basic anti-shipping arguments. Now, I don't think it's fair to judge someone for their taste in romance, so to speak, and, you know, that was the point I was trying to make in my previous video. However, I think it would be dishonest of me to suggest that the only reason Zutara is as popular as it is because its basic arc follows the arc of many well-loved classic and contemporary romance fiction. I can't really speak for Kataangers on this front because I'm not one, well, not anymore at least. But at least for me, you know, the romantic tension, the fluid dynamic, the angst, the push and pull, like I'm not gonna lie, I do love all that stuff, but if I honestly felt that a hot and spicy love tale was all Zutara had going for it, I don't think I would have been nearly as disappointed by the series ending as I actually was. Of course, despite its flaws, I still think Avatar is a good show with some excellent quality writing, especially for a show targeted at kids. I'm not going to deny that. But by nature of this video, I am going to be quite critical of the romantic subplots of the show, and to some extent, the writing in the show overall, particularly in regards to how certain plot points and character arcs were resolved in the finale. Listen, I know what it's like to grow up with like a show or movie franchise and have it be like integral to your childhood. One Sugar Girl was that for me, and like if someone made a video essay outlining all the ways in which the canonical ships in that show are problematic as heck under a more critical viewing, like I'd probably agree, but I'd be agreeing under a lot of duress. So I'm definitely not going to judge you if you want to give this one a pass. The other thing is, like I mentioned earlier, the arguments in support of canonizing a ship fall under different flavors. In the case of Zutara, I would argue that there are two main categories. These being, they should have been canon because they're so gosh darn cute together, ooh woo. Two, they should have been canon because it would have made for a better story. I think it's important to make this distinction clear because these are two completely different arguments and they don't always go together. What I'm trying to say here is, if you don't already enjoy the dynamic between Zuko and Katara, if the thought of them being together just kind of grosses you out for whatever reason, then I'm not expecting this video to change your mind and turn you into a Zutara shipper. What I'm hoping to do instead is to make a solid argument for how Zutara could have enhanced the narrative cohesion in Avatar, how it could have strengthened the core themes and fulfilled the characters' individual arcs, ultimately resulting in a more compelling story, regardless of how you personally might feel about their chemistry as romantic partners. Speaking of making arguments, Can we just get something out of the way right now? Can we stop with the whole, oh my god, okay, the show ended over a decade ago, like, why are you so obsessed? Why can't you just get over it?
I mean, you've got to let it go and move on, man.
If you hadn't noticed, people are still writing essay after essay after essay about how the Star Wars prequels sucked, or who fucking shot first, or like, why couldn't Sam and Frodo, why couldn't everyone have just gotten the Eagles to bring the ring to Mordor, you know, save everyone the entire 6-hour journey. And when it comes to unsatisfactory endings, you know that people are going to be debating the last season of Game of Thrones for years to come. Don't tell me that people aren't going to be complaining about it in 10 years, because you know they will, as they bloody well should.
While Danny kind of forgot about the Iron Fleet.
If people are allowed to write dissertations on Disney movies, cartoons, films that came out years and years ago, I'm allowed to talk about how Zutara could have made for a better story. And if you're willing to entertain those arguments, but you draw the line at delving into the romantic subplots of a story, then that just sounds to me like you have a bias you might want to reflect upon. It might honestly be worth checking if you're approaching the topic from a predisposition that romance arcs are just trashy, mindless, overindulgent wish fulfillment genres that don't really deserve a lot of respect. And you know, anyone who critically engages in it must therefore be nothing other than a lonely despo who's overly obsessed with fictional characters and needs to get a life. Here's the thing, I'm not a romance fan. In preparation for this video, I watched more romance movies and shows than I'd ever bothered to seek out in my life. But that's really besides the point. I love analysing literature. I will always be critically engaging with the books I read and the shows I watch. So I'm sorry if this offends you, but I completely reject the idea that there is something inherently wrong or cringy or shameful about analysing the romantic subplots of a story, you know, like as opposed to any other subplot or element that one can analyse. To me, the romance or ships of a story are no less worthy of discussion and critique than any other part of the story. What I'm saying here is, I don't discriminate on this channel. I have an equal level of hatred and bitter disappointment for the way Game of Thrones ended in season 8, and for the way that Zuko and Katara didn't get together in the last season of Avatar: The Last Airbender. I'm very fair, you know what I mean? I'm all about the equality over here. Please like and subscribe. If it makes any of you feel better, one thing I'm not going to do is, I'm not going to be digging through the show looking for evidence that these characters secretly had feelings for each other or anything like that. I'm also not going to deny that the show teased us about Katara's feelings for Aang and occasionally suggested that maybe she did reciprocate his romantic interest in her. I will talk about that, I'm not just going to ignore it. One of the arguments I've heard fairly often from both sides of the ship war is that if you're going to spend a lot of time and effort teasing at the possibility of a relationship blossoming into romance, it's going to be very unsatisfying for the viewers if this doesn't end up paying off at the end of the show. Both Zutara and Kataang had various moments in the show where the context, subject matter, framing, or overall aesthetic of the scene either hinted at or openly explored the possibility of a romance. Obviously, only one of these two pairings could be canon. Either Kataang was going to be canon and all the Zutara moments were ultimately just a misdirect, or Zutara was going to be canon and Kataang would turn out to be the misdirect. Now, there's certainly a lot to unpack when it comes to the development, pacing, and trajectory of either ship, and we'll get to that, don't you worry, we will get to that. But I would like to posit that at the crux of this argument, perhaps the biggest argument at the centre of the ship war, is the question of to what extent, and under what circumstances, is ship baiting in a show considered justified. To me, as important as pacing is to the development of any plot thread or arc, I would argue that the key to solving this dilemma in a satisfying way rather goes back to what I said before, which resolution would actually enhance the story. A red herring that ultimately serves no purpose to the story whatsoever and is only there to play on the audience's expectations will feel hollow and unsatisfying even if comparatively less screen time has been spent teasing it out. On the other hand, if a misdirect has been interwoven with the story in a way that the reveal of it being a misdirect actually plays into the core themes, then you can dedicate a relatively large portion of the text into exploring the misdirect, and if you've done it right, the audience will likely still enjoy your work, even when you pull the rug out from under their feet. In my opinion, the most important element to a story or subplot's resolution is basically whether it feels earned. And if there's anything we've learned from watching Disney remakes in the last few years, it's that a longer screen time does not necessarily translate to more fulfilling payoffs, character development, or storytelling. Quality over quantity, my friends. So if we really want to do justice to this analysis, we're going to have to look a little bit deeper. Actually, fuck it, I was going to talk about themes and character arcs and everything else before I went into the actual development of each pairing, but I realized that was completely backward. I really need to actually go into like the pacing, the development, the writing and everything, just to give you a bit of context first. See, Kataangers tend to point out that their ship had 3 seasons of development, whereas Zutara really only started seeming viable at the end of Season 2. And given that the first half of Season 3 then contained no interaction between them, any build-up they might have had by the end of Season 3 is dwarfed by the amount of build-up that had already taken place for Kataang, and therefore, crowning Zutara instead of Kataang would have been far less justified, and therefore less satisfying. For what it's worth, I want you to understand that I used to ship Kataang myself. When I first watched the show, I thought they were really cute together. I didn't think they had really crazy sparks or anything like that. But especially around the beginning of the show, a recurring theme was having the audience look at Katara the way Aang sees her. And it was a pretty effective way of making us connect with him as a character, and root for him, and basically want to see him be happy. That's because audiences are automatically drawn to characters who we perceive as strongly motivated or driven in some way. And the story established early on that one of Aang's primary drives was protect Katara, help Katara, make Katara happy, get a kiss from Katara, earn Katara's love. The constant reinforcement of Aang's feelings for Katara and how much it impacted his decisions at crucial moments in the story allowed us to relate to him, to feel what he feels, and to some extent want what he wants. Which, given the framing in this case, meant we kind of wanted Katara to return his feelings. Even now, one of the most common protests against Zutara that I hear is, but what about Aang? Poor Aang. He doesn't deserve this. If Kataang didn't happen, it would break Aang's heart. On that last one, it's interesting. It's interesting that I always hear it framed like that. It's always Aang's heart. Like, if Kataang didn't happen, it would break Aang's heart, not Katara's heart. No one ever says, if Kataang didn't happen, it would break Katara's heart. Now, I'm not trying to take a jab at, like, the viewers or the shippers here. I mean, the fact that a lot of people default to seeing Aang as either the victor or the victim, depending on which way Katara swings, is a pretty natural consequence of the way the ship was actually framed in the show. We see plenty of shots that allow us to know, without a doubt in our minds, how much Aang longs for Katara. Katara's feelings, however, are deliberately played down or given some level of ambiguity. And this was 100% done on purpose. The fact that I, as a Kataanger, could never be 100% sure of Katara's feelings for Aang meant that I rooted for him all the harder. I felt happy for him when it seemed like maybe she did care about him in that way. I was frustrated when it seemed like all his efforts seemed to be for naught. Kataang was a will they get together or won't they situation, and the uncertainty and doubt behind Katara's feelings was an essential part of playing with our feelings, you know, the audience, and creating that tension. Look, Katara gives Aang a kiss on the cheek. Yay, he's making progress. Oh no, she just said she sees him like a brother. Maybe we aren't making progress after all. But wait, she's now suggesting they actually kiss on the lips. I mean, sure, it's a survival situation, and she's never suggested it before, and it's not clear whether she would have if their lives didn't depend on it. But shut up, okay? I'll take it! Are they gonna kiss now? Did they actually kiss? Wait. Did they?
That must be the way out! So, let's go.
No one knows what it's like.
Katara's mixed signals. The fact that any progress Aang made in steering them towards their blissful conclusion in front of a romantic sunset would seem to get reset in the very next episode. The fact that you're constantly asking, does she actually like him, or is she just motherly like that, is kind of the point. Because if the viewers ever actually got solid, undeniable confirmation of a romantic interest in Aang, the way we get with someone like Jet, for instance, it wouldn't be a will they or won't they situation anymore. It would have just turned into a when will they get together situation, which would have dramatically lowered any sense of suspense. Kataang is deliberately written in such a way that makes Katara seem always just slightly out of reach, and it frames her feelings for Aang into a kind of objective that the hero protagonist must struggle towards. And it's a struggle that we, as the audience, can wholly relate to, because we're given multiple repeated opportunities to put ourselves in Aang's shoes. And the fact that Aang's progress doesn't ever seem to last long enough to create a meaningful shift in the dynamic prevents the audience from feeling comfortable and assured about the outcome. Essentially, it is Katara's apparent unattainability that fuels the ship's dramatic tension, and makes reaching the objective seem that much more desirable. We want what we have to struggle for. We want what we can't have. That's the point. Now, I'm not saying that this kind of storytelling is intrinsically bad. It's actually a pretty popular way of writing a romantic subplot, especially for teenage audiences, and it's very common in the superhero/action genre, like I've said before. I myself enjoyed it for a good 1.5 seasons. Especially at the beginning of the show, there was something very pure and sweet about Aang's love for Katara, and the idea that she was someone who could keep him grounded when he was consumed by rage or grief is incredibly powerful. I think it's only natural for a lot of viewers to root for Kataang, especially if they feel like they can identify with Aang as a character. But when people say that Kataang got 3 seasons of development, that's where I have to fundamentally disagree. The entire source of tension behind Kataang as a ship was literally a lack of clear development in order to maintain ambiguity until the 11th hour, and that was completely done on purpose. In a relationship, any kind of relationship that is actually developed on screen, you should be able to track the changes from A to B to C to D. Each time a change in dynamic occurs between 2 characters, that change should stay and define the relationship until something else happens to change the dynamic again, and so on and so on. I talked a little bit about this in my previous video on Beauty and the Beast. Why did Belle warm up to the Beast? Because he gifted her his library, which was a really sweet gesture. Why did he gift her his library? Because the kindness and compassion she showed him when he was hurt, and which he's begun to notice in her day-to-day interactions with others, have really moved his cold black heart. See, in a properly developed romance, the sequence of events is crucial in understanding the journey the characters took from strangers or friends or enemies to eventual lovers. A really easy way to see this is if you were to take the scenes of a properly developed romance and jumble them up, it's very likely that the story would no longer feel contiguous and logical, and it would in all likelihood leave you feeling kind of confused. Look what happens though when I jumble up the scenes of Kataang.
Zuko asked me to be sure I got it to you.
Oh, that's so sweet of Zuko. Would you give him a kiss for me when you see him?
Sure.
Mwah.
Sometimes I forget what a powerful bender that kid is.
Wait, what did you just say?
Nothing, just that Aang is one powerful bender.
I suppose he is. Well, what if we kissed?
Do you know what? I think I've improved it.
And that was just taking the shippy scenes as well. That's not even taking into account that outside of these scenes, their dynamic doesn't actually change. For the vast majority of the show, Katara treats Aang pretty much exactly the same way she's always treated him from the beginning. For example, here is one scene of her and Aang before the kiss that they maybe shared in the Cave of Two Lovers.
This is horrible. But we have to move on.
No. I'm going in to find Boomy.
And here is another scene of her and Aang after the kiss that they maybe shared in the Cave of Two Lovers.
I'm not saying the Avatar state doesn't have incredible and helpful power, but you have to understand, for the people who love you, watching you be in that much rage and pain is really scary.
Actually, I lied. This scene actually happened first, and this scene happened after. Now, if you've seen the show recently, or if you have a very good memory, then you're probably able to catch the lie when I said it. But if you hadn't, if you had to judge purely based on their on-screen dynamic alone, would you have been able to tell which scene must have happened first and which scene must have happened after? I don't think you could. The only time Katara and Aang's relationship dynamic actually seems to break free from the inertia that defines it is pretty much the last half of season 3, where they actually try to give Kataang an arc. And we'll get to that too, don't you worry. While the development in Zutara's case wasn't exactly romantic in nature, there was a logical and sequential backbone to it that didn't really exist in Kataang. You can take these two scenes of Zuko and Katara interacting, for example, and even someone who hasn't ever seen the show will be able to tell you just from the difference in their on-screen dynamic alone which one had to have happened before the forgiving hug scene and which one had to have happened after it.
You should get some rest. We'll be there in a few hours. You'll need all your strength.
Oh, don't you worry about my strength. I have plenty. I'm not the helpless little girl I was when they came. You didn't really say that, did you?
I might as well have.
No, it's not romantic development. But even still, in the half dozen or so episodes where Zuko and Katara actually meaningfully interacted with each other, they still got more on-screen development than Katara and Aang got in 3 whole seasons. Of course, in all fairness, given how little effort was spared for developing Kataang, that's probably not saying much. But my point is that arguing Kataang should have been canon because they had a lot of time to develop their relationship in that direction is not a good argument, because ultimately, they may have had the time to develop it, but they didn't. They purposefully didn't. Now, just to be clear, this is not an argument for Zutara. This is a rebuttal against an anti-Zutara argument. A really common anti-Zutara argument. And that being said, as much as some Zutarians suggest otherwise, I personally don't think there's anything inherently wrong with a relationship that doesn't get a whole lot of on-screen development, or, one that might seem a bit one-sided for most of the story. Like I said, my favourite Disney movie of all time is Beauty and the Beast.
After all this time, he's finally learned to love.
That's it then. That should break the spell.
But it's not enough. She has to love him in return.
I know he looks vicious, but he's really kind and gentle. He's my friend. I love you.
A largely asymmetrical, one-sided romance, even a poorly developed one, isn't automatically trash. However, certain narrative choices surrounding the development of a romance, or lack thereof, can make the ending feel somewhat unearned, or forced, or even wholly out of place. So I did say I was going to talk about season 3, right? Let's get into that. So in season 3, Aang goes from being a love-struck but hapless wooby to someone with significantly more confidence and romantic courage, shall we say. Some fans interpret Aang's increased assertiveness or dedication with regard to pursuing a relationship with Katara to be a direct result of the internal struggle which Aang had to grapple with in the season 2 finale. We'll get to that in a bit. Whatever the case may be, Aang is considerably bolder in his advances towards Katara this season. It starts off relatively innocently, with a very sweet dance they share in episode 2. Their dynamic, as always, resets to how it was before after this episode. However, Nightmares and Daydreams reminds us that Aang's feelings for Katara are still as strong as ever, as he imagines a version of Katara who is reciprocative of his advances, and is also closer to his own height, which puts them on a more even footing for kissing. This builds up to the Black Sun invasion, when Aang, in a moment of uncertainty over his chances of surviving his first encounter with Fire Lord Ozai, interrupts Katara in the middle of her sentence to give her a surprise kiss. This is the first time that Aang's feelings for Katara have been brought completely out into the open, and Katara can no longer remain naive or oblivious about the situation. She can have no doubt as to where he stands emotionally. Katara reacts to this startling revelation with visible shock, followed by this look, which, I guess, gotta keep that will they or won't they energy alive somehow, am I right? I've heard a surprising number of fans argue fervently that Katara actually unambiguously kisses Aang back in this scene. Which,
You lied to me. I guessed piano, and you said that...
I'm really sorry about last night. We were talking and saying things. I just got carried away, and before I knew it,
You talk too much.
Marty.
I think when you're showing, less enthusiasm and passion in your kiss than someone who was literally asleep, Houston, darling, sweetie, baby, we might have a bit of a problem. I gotta stop making rebuttals. Alright, come on, stay on track. Stay focused, Carolyn. Focused. Where were we? Black Sun kiss. Right. So, after the Black Sun double episode, things get kind of weird in the romance department, particularly knowing how it all wraps up. Zuko joins the gang in the next episode, much to Katara's displeasure because she's still understandably upset about his betrayal in the Crystal Catacombs. She eventually goes along with it, at least publicly, but in private she lets him know in no uncertain terms that she definitely doesn't trust him, and that she will take him down if he ever appears to be a threat to Aang. The next 3 episodes don't really contain any major interaction between Katara and Aang, or Katara and Zuko, other than some snarky quips that Katara makes towards Zuko because she's still mad. Again, totally understandable. Interesting to note, though, that for someone who supposedly doesn't buy his transformation and is apparently holding back from granting trust, Katara is apparently perfectly willing to let Zuko take both Aang and Sokka alone on extended field trips that seem to last at least several days? I don't know about you guys, but I don't think trust is really the issue here, but okay, Katara. Also, you'd think that they'd maybe add a little bit of Kataang tension, seeing that they had an unresolved kiss a few episodes ago and they're going to be the endgame couple or whatever. Just maybe a good idea to distribute some of that narrative tension onto Katara and Aang, rather than keeping it all onto Katara and Zuko. Or not. That works too, I guess. So the next episode, arguably one of the most Zutara-heavy episodes of the show, opens with Azula crashing the party and the gang having to split up because of it. Katara has to separate from her family again, and also again because of the Fire Nation. The psychotic, warmongering Fire Nation leadership, royalty, whatever you want to call it, is once again responsible for Katara having to part with her family, and even if this time it's not as permanent as what happened to Kaya, it's not hard to see why Katara dumps all of this bitterness, resentment, and anger onto Zuko. She still hasn't forgiven him for the catacombs drama. She feels like he manipulated her in a moment of weakness when she spilled her guts out to him about the trauma of losing her mother. And indirectly as it may be, from her perspective, it wouldn't be that difficult to see these latest shenanigans as just another extension of Fire Nation Royal Command ripping her family apart. This is why the Southern Raiders is primarily centered around the theme of restitution, reparation, and forgiveness, and not about rebuilding trust. Zuko initially mistakes Katara's open hostility towards him as an indication of her continuing distrust, but quickly realizes that it's actually stemming from a deep-rooted sense of bitterness and resentment about what the Fire Nation has stolen from her childhood. Like I said, for anyone who's been paying attention, it's pretty obvious that Katara justifying her animosity as nothing more than just reasonable skepticism about Zuko's true intentions is kind of...
The lie detector determined that was a lie.
Zuko realizes that what Katara needs isn't proof of his redemption or trustworthiness, it's healing. And the only way she can begin the path of healing is by facing her trauma, and maybe finding some modicum of closure. Something which, given his own backstory with his own mother, is probably something Zuko himself can personally relate to. Aang, on the other hand, is not so keen on the idea.
We're going to find the man who took my mother from me.
I know who did it, and I know how to find him.
And what exactly do you think this will accomplish?
I knew you wouldn't understand.
This one episode alone has probably seen the most carnage and destruction in the shipping wars. This one and Ember Island players, I think. The characters' decisions, actions, inactions, choice of words, etc., has been scrutinized and dissected and used as fodder in many a shipping debate. Because a lot of the inferences that you can draw from the text will partially come down to viewer interpretation, which itself is informed by the different experiences we've had and the types of media that we've previously consumed. So I'll try to keep this brief. There are a few things which I think are more or less objectively undeniable. The first thing I think we can all agree on is that Katara faces her demons in this episode, and for the first time, or at least the first time that we've seen, opens up about what was likely the darkest chapter of her life, the day her mother died. And curiously, it is Zuko, someone who she still hasn't forgiven yet at this point, who she decides to share this incredibly emotional story with, not her canonical love interest. Katara also, at least initially, seems very frustrated about Aang's repeated hints, requests, urges, etc. to forgive Yon-Ra. Aang's words of comfort or sympathy are always followed by an expression of worry about what she was going to do.
I do understand. How do you think I felt about the Sandbenders when they stole Appa?
What? She needs us, Aang. This is about getting closure and justice.
I don't think so. I think it's about getting revenge.
Or relief that she ultimately didn't do what he was so afraid of.
Zuko told me what you did. Or what you didn't do, I guess. I'm proud of you.
For his part, Zuko never really gives Katara his opinion on what choice she should make when push comes to shove. He figures out where to go, asks her if she's ready, facilitates their meeting, and otherwise doesn't really interfere. And the one time that she does open her heart out to him, he responds with genuine understanding and nothing more.
Your mother was a brave woman.
I know.
At the end of the episode, after Katara decides against killing Yon-Ra, Zuko takes her to Ember Island, where Aang finds her sitting at the pier, still unsure whether she was justified or not in letting Yon-Ra live. Aang is relieved that she is okay, proud of her for rejecting revenge, and glad that she ultimately chose forgiveness. At this, Katara frowns at his assumption and insists that she did not and would never forgive Yon-Ra, but that she was now ready to forgive Zuko. They embrace, and Katara walks off screen, while Zuko smiles and says to Aang that he was right about vengeance not being what Katara needed. There's a lot to unpack here, too much to do in this one video. If you want a more detailed analysis of how the Southern Raiders validate Zutara more than Kataang, I'll chuck some links in the description for you to check out. For the purposes of this video though, I just want to say a few things. This episode is where the tension between Zuko and Katara finally comes to a head and ultimately gets resolved. That part's indisputable. But it also, for some reason, introduces another layer of tension between Katara and Aang, as his philosophy of pacifism and mercy comes into conflict with Katara's apparent desire for retribution. Katara ends up clashing with Aang in this episode, arguably more than she's done in any episode before this. Regardless of whose side of the clash you find more defensible, at the end of the day, Katara literally turns away from Aang with a look of frustration/displeasure or whatever you want to call that, leaves the tension hanging, and turns to resolve her clash with Zuko instead. In effect, the writers have created an episode which closes one rift between Katara and Zuko, while opening another one between Katara and Aang that was never really there before, and then leaving that rift just sort of hanging there like an awkward silence at a dinner party. For such a painful disagreement, Katara and Aang don't make up at the end of this episode. And I don't remember any other episode before this where Katara and Aang had a tiff, and this tiff not being resolved by the end credits. The Southern Raiders gives us an episode where Katara and Zuko reach a new level of intimacy in their relationship. A level of intimacy that we've never seen Katara share with anyone before or since, in the same episode that creates an emotional distance between her and Aang, one that doesn't get cleared up. The added context that this is all happening 5 episodes after the Black Sun kiss, which has still not been addressed by either party at this point, and this also being Aang and Katara's first interaction since that episode to have a major impact on their dynamic, is at best really awkward storytelling. But wait, there's more! Next, we have the Ember Island Players episode. Again, lots of different interpretations here. Like this one shot of Zuko and Katara awkwardly edging away from each other as the Ember Island players perform a rather more raunchy version of their encounter in the Crystal Catacombs. For some, it's clear evidence that Zuko and Katara are grossed out just by the idea of being with each other. For others, it wouldn't be the first time that 2 eventual romantic leads awkwardly attempted to feign disinterest towards each other because they hadn't acknowledged or come to terms with their feelings about each other yet. Not that they were eventual romantic leads, just that the scene could have been contextualized that way and it would have made sense, you know, like that's the argument. Anyway, whatever, I'm not here to discuss that, okay, I don't care. I'll let you guys judge, alright? What I will say though, is that as I previously mentioned, Zuko and Katara's friendly dynamic in this episode feels organic, having come from the heels of their reconciliation at the end of the last episode. They engage in playful banter, the tone of which is markedly different to the spiteful jabs Katara had been dishing to Zuko before she forgave him, and at one point, Stage Zuko viciously taunts Stage Iroh before abandoning him to join ranks with Azula, to which Katara turns to Zuko in a mixture of disbelief and sorrow. The events of the past episode have given Zuko and Katara a strong foundation for their friendship, and given Katara's natural compassion and warmth, it's not surprising to see her show genuine care and concern towards him. It's been a long journey to this point, but Katara and Zuko are now finally actually friends, and the threads of connection that they've shared in earlier episodes, while technically still being on opposing sides, are now fully realized and revealed to be just as wholesome as those earlier scenes hinted that they would be. Meanwhile, Kataang is,
We kissed at the invasion, and I thought we were gonna be together, but we're not.
Aang, I don't know.
Why don't you know?
This isn't the right time.
Well, when is the right time?
Aang, I'm sorry, but right now I'm just a little confused.
Oh, hell no!
Okay, I just said I was confused.
Okay, so again, interpretations abound. In this scene, Katara is repeatedly suggesting that she wants to disengage from this conversation. When she first approaches Aang out of concern, she appears to be oblivious to the real reason behind Aang's distress, which is the fact that he feels she doesn't return his feelings. And as soon as the topic steers to the Black Sun kiss, or where her feelings actually stand, she appears kind of uncomfortable. She gives non-committal answers like, I don't know, I'm confused, and the more Aang pushes for a more definite answer, the more she pulls back and sort of retreats, until she's finally provoked into giving a more assertive response. So, was Aang right or wrong? Was Katara actually interested in just avoiding the topic? Was she honestly just confused? Or was she just trying to put him down gently, using the kind of language and body language that I think a lot of women and girls can relate to having used to put guys down gently? Obviously, we know that they get together in the end, but without that hindsight, this scene is, again, purposely written to be able to suggest that it might not happen. We're not supposed to be sure that Katara ends up with Aang, remember? The reward won't be as sweet if victory is perceived to be certain. I mean, if you don't believe me that this scene can easily be contextualized in different ways by multiple different resolutions, show this scene to someone who's never seen the show, and tell them that in the end, these two characters don't end up getting together, and ask them for their thoughts on it. Chances are they'll tell you all the ways that they see Katara's response foreshadowing such a conclusion. Like I said earlier, I am not particularly interested in arguing, how Katara must have secretly felt, or whether Aang was actually justified, whatever, okay? I'm not here for that. I'm just here to pull apart the writing. Ultimately, what this scene gives us is yet another conflict between Katara and Aang, which culminates in Katara responding negatively to something Aang says or does, walking away, and again, it's another conflict between them that doesn't get resolved at the end of the episode. Are you starting to see a pattern here yet? That's twice in a row. We have 4 episodes left. Things are looking ironically bleaker than they have ever looked before for Kataang. I guess they're trying to go for the whole the night is darkest before the dawn thing? Whatever the case, things don't really get better from here. They don't really get better until literally the last scene. In the 4-part Sozin's Comet finale, Aang spends most of his time away from the gang. There's little to no interaction between him and Katara before he leaves and goes on his spirit journey. And literally, their last line of dialogue in the whole show is this.
None of you understands the position I'm in!
Aang, we do understand. It's just...
Just what, Katara? What?
We're trying to help!
Then when you figure out a way for me to beat the Fire Lord without taking his life, I'd love to hear it!
Aang, don't walk away from this!
That's where things end off between them. That's their arc. This is literally their final interaction before the kiss. This is how things end between them. Meanwhile, let's check up on our Zutara pairing. Let's have a look at where are they at? Oh, okay. Yeah, just closer than ever then. That's not confusing at all. Zuko and Katara spend, almost the entirety of Sozin's Comet together. Almost every scene of them puts them side by side, whether it's fighting alongside each other, or consoling one another, or inviting one another to final battles. I swear I'm not exaggerating. Watch the 4-part finale again. Zuko and Katara spend about 90% of it joined at the hip. While I'm on this point, at this point, I don't see how there is any basis for the argument that, if Zuko and Katara ever got together, they'd just be toxic. They'd be fighting all the time, they'd be constantly miserable and angsty and always at each other's throats. You can see their dynamic now that they've gone and put the past behind them. I mean, freaking hell, you could see it even before they went and put their past behind them. That's kind of why this ship was so compelling for so many viewers, but especially now, Zuko, Katara, toxic?
Who said that? Who said that? Who said that? Who had been saying that?
Zuko and Katara being toxic as hell, an empirical study. Exhibit A, Zuko suggesting Katara give Aang time to process his feelings, to which Katara readily accepts. Exhibit B, Katara reaching out to Zuko to offer him empathy and encouragement in a moment of genuine despair about facing the uncle he betrayed. Exhibit C, Katara trying to ease Zuko's fears about their chances of surviving the battle with Azula, and the chances of Aang being able to defeat Ozai. Exhibit D, Zuko suggesting that he face Azula alone because he thinks their odds will be slightly better this way, to which Katara initially protests but then ultimately decides to trust his judgment. Exhibit E, Zuko literally leaping in front of a lightning bolt to save Katara's life, and Katara running across the battlefield with almost reckless abandon in a desperate attempt to heal him. How can Zuko and Katara ever recover from such a volatile and destructive relationship? Somebody get these kids professional help before it is too late.
Speaking of that lightning scene though, okay, yeah, I'm gonna get back on track. Just give me a second. I need to talk about this because can we please agree for 1 second, alright, that scene was obviously ship baiting. I mean, yes, Zuko would have jumped in front of lightning for anyone. No, Katara shouldn't be with someone just because he jumped in front of lightning for her. That's a bad argument. Don't make that argument. And yes, you could even argue that Zuko sacrificing himself for Katara is nothing more than the natural conclusion of his redemption arc, you know, at least on paper. Sounds sensible. And even that Katara could represent like a sister, you know, like a good sister as opposed to his evil sister. Like I've heard some people use that argument and in theory I'm not totally opposed to it, you know. It's a decent way of framing their relationship, I guess, at least on paper. But the problem is, can we please agree that there is a shitload of romantic coding all over this scene? The framing of this scene makes it reminiscent of every movie scene ever, where one character, usually the guy, but not always, desperately tries to save the love of his life. You have the cliche dramatic no, you have the soft music followed by a close-up reaction shot of her eyes, everything's in slow motion. These are tried and true cinematographic techniques to signify cheese, of usually the romantic kind. Generally speaking, the only way to avoid romantic subtext while employing these tropes is if you've already gone and established the two characters in question to have some kind of pre-existing dynamic, which would make a romantic undertone inappropriate, or at least highly improbable. Like if the two characters have a significant age gap, such that they have more of a mentor/mentee, or maybe even a parent-child relationship. Traditionally, making two characters be of the same sex used to be one way to avoid romantic implications. You know, back when like a legitimate on-screen same-sex relationship was considered too absurd of an idea for anyone to take seriously. But that definitely no longer holds true today, and regardless of what safeguards you employ, it's always going to be a delicate balancing act between platonic angst and unintentionally cringy romantic connotations, which is why you never see this sort of framing between an actual brother and sister. So when people argue that this scene is like totally compatible with a sibling dynamic between Zuko and Katara, I'm always just like, what kind of brother-sister movies have you been watching? Are you seriously telling me that you can just substitute Sokka into that scene and it wouldn't come off cringy as heck?
What you say? That you only meant well.
Keep it in the family, okay?
Look, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that Zuko was clearly canonically in love with Katara in this scene. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that this scene is a blatant example of ship baiting, and you cannot tell me that it wasn't. Now, you can argue that this in and of itself doesn't really hold enough narrative weight to really mean anything in the overall scheme of things. And yeah, you know, sure, I'm willing to work with that. But this kind of goes back to what I was saying before about when is ship teasing good writing. When you consider the broader context of this scene, the structural placement of it in the wider narrative, some glaring problems start to emerge. This, right here, is the last scene, the last interaction between Zuko and Katara before the show attempts to put an end to the ship wars by finally revealing to us who the endgame couples are. What was Aang and Katara's last scene again? Oh yeah, 3 episodes ago when he exchanged some harsh words with everyone and stormed off in a huff. God, it's just a mess. You know the strangest thing about it all? I was watching Toy Story 2 recently, and watching Jessie and Buzz gradually become more than friends made me realize something. If the creators of Avatar had just gotten rid of all the weird drama between Aang and Katara, cut out all the kisses, all the fights, all the awkward attempts to create unnecessary tension between them, keep the headband dance scene, and just get rid of everything else, just have them be friends the way they'd always been, all the way to the big damn kiss at the end of the show. It would have gone over way smoother. It would have literally been like Buzz and Jessie's relationship in Toy Story 2. Cute, fluffy, nothing particularly deep or profound about it, but also totally harmless. No drama, no angst, everyone wins. I mean, it's not like drama and angst was what was drawing the shippers to the Kataang ship. No, they liked it for the fact that it was low conflict and fluffy. Why couldn't they have just kept it that way? Everyone would have been happy. Just to recap everything so far. In the last half of season 3, the final arc of the show, we see Aang propel his relationship with Katara to the next stage. He does this by giving her a kiss, which ultimately triggers a negative response from her. Far from bringing them closer together, this kiss went unacknowledged by both Aang and Katara until 6 episodes later, by which point the two of them had 2 serious clashes. They had another disagreement, this time with the whole group involved, right before Aang stormed off. Not one of these clashes was ever resolved on screen. Muddying this even more is the fact that this is all in stark contrast to the sort of dynamic they'd shared for like the entire show up until now. In the past, Katara and Aang rarely fought, and when they did fight, they always made up before the episode finished. For some reason, the creators decided that right at the end of their arc, before the grand reveal, that was the time to create major, unresolved discord between Katara and Aang before keeping them apart for the rest of the finale. And meanwhile, while all this was going on, Zuko and Katara were mending their rift, sharing their deepest hurts, easing each other's sorrows, covering each other's backs, saving each other's lives, jumping in front of lightning for each other. And after all that, ladies and gentlemen, that's when they decide to end the ship wars once and for all by having Katara decide to pair off with Aang and Mai with Zuko.
Boo! Pick a plot line!
When people say that Kataang felt kind of forced and maybe Zutara might have been a little less forced, even with a shorter length of time spent on developing it, this is basically what they're talking about. And the fact is that this isn't something that you can see just by looking at any one scene, nor is it something you can rectify by fixing any particular scene. This is a structural problem. The show decided to pair Katara up with Aang and Zuko with Mai at the moment when Katara and Zuko have literally never been closer, and where Katara and Aang have never been further apart. It's just a mess. And unfortunately, that's not even the half of it. It's time we talk about Aang. From the very beginning of the show, Aang's infatuation with Katara is obvious, and to be honest, very understandable. Katara is always there for him when he needs it. She's the person he can dump all of his feelings on and receive unflinching support and understanding. She's also fiercely protective of him, whether it's from barbed comments by rude strangers, or from actual threats to his physical safety. And I'm not going to say that he, took advantage of her or anything like that, but within their relationship, Katara was definitely the one performing 99% of the emotional labor. Comforting, healing, soothing, always providing a non-judgmental ear to vent his frustrations to. Suffice it to say that to Aang, Katara was a constant, a shining light, someone he could always lean on in a crisis. Which poses an interesting question. Did Aang fall for Katara because he saw her as perfect? Or is it his feelings for her that are making her appear perfect to him? Honestly, it's hard to say, but given the way Katara cares for Aang, I don't think anyone can blame him for how much he did come to idolize her. How he saw her through rose-tinted glasses, or as a beacon of hope in his darkest hours. To Aang especially, Katara is practically angelic, and on the occasions where her non-angelic sides ever do get brought to the forefront, the admittedly rare moments when Aang actually gets to witness Katara deviate from her soothing, empathetic, motherly persona, he doesn't usually seem to know how to respond. He tends to deal with these moments by brushing her negative qualities aside, or downplaying her aggression or rage when it becomes too much to ignore.
No, she's not blaming you.
No, I'm blaming her.
Hey!
It was at this moment that he knew. He fucked up.
And speaking of Katara, there is a bit of a feedback loop going on as well. See, Katara often makes an extra effort to be warm and supportive and patient with Aang, almost to the point of coddling him sometimes.
He really responds well to a positive teaching experience. Kind words. If he's doing something wrong, maybe a gentle nudge in the right direction.
Now, I should add that Aang's obliviousness, or ineptitude towards Katara's rage is mostly played for laughs prior to the Southern Raiders, and I do respect that. However, whether intentionally or not, having Aang continually deny Katara's agency during her worst moments, combined with the fact that Katara is repeatedly given to swallowing her pain or angst or resentment around him, the reasons for which being up to you, the viewer, to decide, what matters is this effectively shields Aang from engaging meaningfully with Katara's dark sides.
You don't have to do this for me. I can find another teacher.
The effect of this is twofold. One, it locks them into a dynamic where Katara is perpetually the comforter and rarely the comforted, and 2, it insulates Aang from having to reconcile his rosy-tinted view of Katara with her real, flawed self. That being said, with respect to Kataang, idealization doesn't have to mean bad. Characters becoming immediately enamored with an idealized, flawless view of the subject of their infatuation is nothing new in film, nor does it necessarily spell doom for the relationship. Some of the most popular romances are written about characters who fall in love at first sight in this way. And while usually characters who begin the romance idolizing each other tend to move past this by the end of the story, probably because most audiences aren't particularly keen on the idea of validating a love story between two characters with fictionalized rosy perceptions of one another, it'd be unfair for me not to acknowledge that there are plenty of enduring love stories which never really frame it as an issue in the first place, much less one that needs to be corrected.
But you don't understand, Osgood. I'm a man. Well, nobody's perfect.
Personally, as a Kataang shipper at the time, I wasn't really paying that much attention to it, and I probably never would have, if it weren't for the fact that the story decided to suggest that maybe Aang's attachment to Katara posed some kind of narrative problem. At the end of Season 2, the writers introduced some elements that significantly changed the stakes for Kataang. Aang learned that mastery of the Avatar state would require him to unlock his chakras, the last of which required him to let go of all earthly attachments. In the episode where we learn that all of our hero's grief and loss over his people had been displaced onto the girl who'd pulled him out of the ice and woken him from his 100-year-long beauty sleep, Aang also learns that the attachment he has towards said girl is preventing him from reaching the emotional and spiritual clarity necessary to master the Avatar state. Upon hearing that his duty to the world requires him to let go of this attachment, Aang initially reacts with furious indignation.
How could it be a bad thing that I feel an attachment to her? 3 chakras ago, that was a good thing.
I just want to be loved. Is that so wrong?
After this, Aang, with deep reluctance, struggles to unlock the 7th chakra twice. The first time, a vision of Katara in distress breaks his concentration and stops him from letting go right as he is about to unblock the chakra. One episode later, he tries again, and after meditating for 20 seconds in a crystal tent, he emerges seemingly victorious, only for Azula to shoot him down with a lightning bolt before he can do anything. Although Katara's spirit water revives him, his 7th chakra remains blocked for almost the entirety of Season 3, a fact he acknowledges in Episode 17, Ember Island Players.
Overreacting? If I hadn't blocked my chakra, I'd probably be in the Avatar state right now.
So to properly contextualize the issue that Aang is facing here, we need to talk about character arcs. There are 2 types of obstacles that characters in film and television tend to face: internal struggles versus external ones. The difference is fairly intuitive. Internal struggles are those which force a character to contend with opposing beliefs, desires, or needs within themselves. External struggles are obstacles put in the character's path that are wholly outside of their control. While most stories will contain sources of both internal and external struggles, in modern storytelling and literature, it's often the internal struggles that resonate more deeply with the audience. This is because it's usually the inner conflicts that are able to spark the emotional connection between the viewer and the story. Internal struggles generate growth. Internal struggles are personal. Internal struggles are relatable. Want to know why there are like zillions of stories of high schoolers fighting monsters single-handedly every week while simultaneously buckling under the intense pressure of juggling homework assignments and teen drama? The truth is that the chance of the average viewer ever finding themselves in a dramatic face-off against a diabolical psychopathic supervillain in a clash that will determine the fate of the world is basically slim to none. But the vast majority of viewers will have undergone experiences which allow them to personally connect to themes like unrequited love, heartache, the difficulty of committing to responsibility or moral integrity over instant gratification. That's why, as counterintuitive as it may seem, stories will often frame the metaphorical struggles a character faces as more difficult to triumph, and also more rewarding to overcome than the literal battle against the big bad. Aang's need to defeat the Fire Lord and stop him from enslaving the entire world is an external struggle. The Guru, on the other hand, presented Aang with what might possibly be the greatest challenge he's had to face thus far: the invitation to walk down a path that we all know Aang is deeply opposed to, the need to let go of his attachment to Katara. The emotional stakes are higher now, because shit's just gotten personal. Like most internal struggles, Aang's inner conflict with regard to his emotional entanglement represents a want versus need dilemma, where a character's flawed personality trait / belief / worldview is represented by their want, and their need being the thing that will define their character growth. Some examples of wants include the want to continue being a genius billionaire playboy philanthropist who funds his extravagant lifestyle through shameless and prolific war profiteering. The want to emulate the charm and personality of the most popular girl in school in order to usurp her authority and steal back your crush. The want to posthumously fulfill the promise you made to your dead wife by rigging up 20,622 helium balloons to your house, navigate it several thousand miles through wind and rain to the heart of the Venezuelan jungle in the hopes of finally accomplishing her lifelong dream of living on the edge of a cliff. As one does. Usually though, the characters will find themselves embroiled in a series of external events or pressures that force them to alter their worldview. It could be something they witness that forces them to gain a new perspective. Maybe it's the consequences of their own actions that they find themselves face to face with. Maybe they finally attained the thing they wanted and it didn't give them the fulfillment they expected it to. The struggle between continuing to do what you want to do versus doing what you should be doing is basically the struggle between want versus need. And usually, by the end of the story, it is the need, not the want, which shapes the character's new purpose. The need to learn humility and self-sacrifice as you take on the mantle of being a literal hero instead of a cold-blooded egomaniacal weapons manufacturer. The need to rediscover and accept your genuine self, to be truthful and sincere instead of deceptive and shallow, to not allow your self-worth to be defined by your appearance or social standing. The need to regain a sense of hope and love even in the aftermath of intense sorrow and heartache. In the case of protagonists, the want versus need dilemma is also usually resolved in a way that allows the hero to overcome some kind of flaw. Selfishness, vanity, cynicism, ignorance, apathy. The end of the story will show the characters attaining a completely different way of seeing the world, more nuanced, more optimistic, or maybe just something worth fighting for. Ultimately, at the story's close, our heroes will have changed irreparably, usually into better, more wholesome versions of themselves, and the choices they make will confirm this transformation and reflect the new life path that they've committed to. So, what does this all mean for Aang? What sort of character growth might we expect to arise as he grapples with the inner conflict that Guru Pathik's teachings have set into motion? If want versus need is supposed to ultimately drive a character to change for the better, then in what way could letting go of attachment to Katara actually facilitate some kind of positive change in Aang? We know that Aang is completely smitten with Katara and dreams of having a future with her. We know that he often depends on her kindness and unconditional warmth towards him. We know that he adores her to no end, even to the point of idolatry at times. And we know that his attachment to her is something he needs to overcome if he is to succeed in his task of defeating the Fire Lord. However you decide to interpret the Guru's directive or what letting go of attachment might mean in this case, there is one thing that we can be fairly certain about. Regardless of whether Aang actually ends up with Katara, something is going to have to change regarding his feelings towards her. And whatever it is, it will probably also change his relationship with her in some observable way. And on top of that, given what we know already about want versus need, it would be reasonable to expect that whatever this change is, it would also be accompanied by some kind of perceptible growth in Aang as a character. As the hero of the story, we would expect Aang to emerge from this inner conflict as a more mature or fully realized version of himself than before. In learning to embrace his need over his want, we'd expect his actions to demonstrate a wiser or healthier way of perceiving the world and or his place in it. Like I said, there are a lot of different ways that you can choose to interpret the task demanded of Aang in episode 39, and indeed, countless fans have attempted to answer this very question. There's more than one way, certainly, that Aang's feelings towards Katara could undergo some level of meaningful change that could be interpreted as letting go of attachment, while suggesting a certain amount of growth from Aang. But in my opinion, the most sensible way of going about it would have been to dismantle Aang's idealization and dependency on Katara as a person.
Baby, you're my forever girl.
And I say this for a few reasons. On a simplistic level, romances where the characters are accepted warts and all tend to be perceived as more genuine than romances that seem to present a false sense of perfection. In real life, we often perceive the rose-tinted infatuation that Aang feels for Katara as being in love with the glamorized idea of a person, as opposed to true love where you embrace that person's imperfections and humanity. But in this case, I also think it goes a bit deeper than that. One of the core themes of Avatar is that first impressions, preconceived notions, and black and white ways of conceptualizing things can often turn out to be untrue. And not only that, but clinging to these ideals can expose you to danger and heartache. Part of growing up is learning to see the grey in the world. Not everything is all good or all bad. It's for this reason that I believe having Aang and Katara overcome their ideals of each other would have felt thematically consistent and therefore also resonant to many viewers. To me, the Guru episode kind of represented a point of no return for Kataang. Up until that point, I never really felt like the romantic subplots of Avatar provided anything more than just a cute little distraction here and there from the main plot of the show. But once the show presented Aang's attachment to Katara as a flaw which he was going to have to put work in to overcome, suddenly the romance gained a lot more narrative significance. Because now, the outcome of it would somehow have to be directly tied to Aang's character growth and the end of the story. This is regardless of how things might ultimately play out between Katara and Aang, because character growth is how you make the resolution of a character's inner conflict feel earned. If Aang letting go of his attachment to Katara meant Aang letting go of his idealization of her, then I think logically either one of two things should have happened. Either he was going to learn to love her in a more mature or realistic kind of way, or he was going to realize that his love for her was never truly real in the first place, being built upon a romanticized view of her that didn't represent the real her. Well, we know that Katara and Aang end up together, right? So does that mean they went with the first option? No. Sorry, spoiler alert, Aang doesn't really learn anything. Turns out he never actually needed to either. All he needed was a rock and some 11th hour line turtle shenanigans. Who needs character growth when you can just chuck in some good old Deus Ex Machinas? See, this is the deeper problem with the conflicts that Katara and Aang face in the latter half of Season 3, and the way their relationship ended up being portrayed. The newly introduced and ultimately unresolved clashes between them weren't just bad because of unfortunate timing. They were bad because in the context of Aang's internal conflict, they kept providing him opportunities to grow and then not following through with it. In fact, they completely insulated him from any real character growth that he was explicitly set up to go through, and yet still rewarded him anyway. The unresolved conflict which involved Aang struggling to contend with Katara's dark side. The unresolved conflict which involved Aang failing to respond appropriately to Katara's boundaries. The fact that, for whatever reason, the creators decided that it would be Zuko and not Aang who would connect with Katara as she revealed the true depths of her agony and grief over losing her mother. For someone whose wholesome character growth is supposed to be triggered by letting go of attachment to a girl he's long held an idealized view of, this is just bad. And the worst part of it all is that it didn't even have to be. There were so many ways that Kataang could have been fixed, easy ways that would have made them feel more earned. Lots of ways that the writing could have humanized Katara to Aang, could have allowed him to gain a more well-rounded understanding of her, have him be more cognizant of her needs and her flaws. Season 3 could have shown Aang becoming more perceptive towards Katara's pain or anger, prompting him to take a more proactive role in soothing it than he'd ever done before. The point where Zuko joins the gang in the Western Air Temple presented a perfect opportunity for this. It wasn't like Katara was making much of an effort to hide her utter dislike of Team Avatar's newest member. It wouldn't have been difficult to have Aang pick up on Katara's simmering rage and reach out to her. Maybe offer her a listening ear and try to soothe some of her anger. Or maybe the Southern Raiders could give Aang a chance to invite Katara to vent her grief onto him, allowing their bond to deepen as they commiserate on how they'd both suffered deeply as a result of the 100-Year War. Maybe Aang could apologize for being too harsh or unfair in comparing her to Jet, or equating the loss of her mother to him losing Appa. Or you could even go the opposite way. Have Katara come to recognize the wisdom in his advice and thank him for guiding her in the right way, rather than still being unsure if she had done the right thing or not. Ideally, you'd maybe do a bit of both. If you're going to have Katara and Aang call each other out in a big clash, something they rarely ever do on the show, then show us how it brings them to a healthier place of understanding and humility and respect towards one another. Let them own their mistakes and grow closer as a result of it. And let Aang grow as he embraces the fact that Katara is not a perfect angel by any means, and show us how he falls for her all the harder because of it. Instead, we get none of that. And even if you disagree with me that Aang overcoming an idealized view of Katara should have been a logical outcome of letting go of his attachment to her, surely you'd agree with me that Aang's behavior towards Katara in Season 3 does not suggest that he did, in fact, by some other measure, manage to become less attached to her. If anything, he seems more determined than ever to make a relationship between them happen. He fantasizes about finally winning her affections in nightmares and daydreams. Then, in Day of Black Sun, he kisses her without warning and without checking to see if she even wanted him to. And in Ember Island Players, he acts jealous and possessive at the mere suggestion that maybe she wasn't the Avatar's girl after all. If this is all meant to be Aang regressing in his character arc, You know, like how Zuko went back to the Fire Nation before finally getting his head in the right place. That would be fine, except for the fact that we're never actually given a scene in which Aang clearly develops insight over the way he's been feeling and acting towards Katara, particularly the ways in which his actions might have been inappropriate or unhealthy. The way the show portrays Katara and Aang's dynamic in Season 3, especially the way Aang behaves in it and is never really made to take accountability for it, is nothing you'd expect from a character whose development supposedly hinges upon letting go of attachment. Scene after scene, we see Aang plunge deeper and deeper into pursuing his want. We never get a scene where he finally learns to accept his need. Now, as I mentioned before, I believe there are two ways that Season 3 could have delivered a payoff to the dilemma posed to Aang in the end of Season 2. Unlike what some Zutarans believe, I do think that there was certainly plenty of room to explore how Aang learning to let go of attachment could have ultimately brought Katara and Aang closer together. Just like Aladdin learning to embrace his truth was the thing that finally made him worthy of being Jasmine's suitor. Like I said, I've talked about the relatively easy ways that I think Kataang could have been fixed. When I was watching the show for the first time though, the fact that Avatar didn't seem interested in fixing Kataang and instead started introducing all these issues while simultaneously developing Zutara into an incredibly wholesome, intimate and powerful dynamic, all that made me think that reconciling Kataang with Aang's need to let go of attachment to Katara wasn't really on the cards, wasn't really what they were going to go with. That instead, they were actually committing to the idea of having them be false leads. That they were going to go with the other option, in which Aang, after clinging for so long to his angelic, romanticized ideal of Katara, was ultimately going to realize that his feelings for her were not real. That this was going to be his moment of clarity, his growth. Yeah, we know of course that none of that actually happens. The dilemma presented to Aang in the Season 2 finale ultimately played no role in the mastery of the Avatar state in his final battle with Ozai. It also played no role in the resolution of his romance with Katara. I don't know, maybe Guru Pathik was just old and he misspoke and what he really meant to say was that the more attached you are, the better. Why not? That makes as much sense as anything else so far.
Learn to let her go.
No.
Or you cannot let the pure cosmic energy flow in from the universe.
Not even close.
But at the time, without knowing how things were going to end, the Kataang are actually false romantic leads made a lot of sense to me. And honestly, it still does. And it's not just because of the pacing or timing decisions in Season 3. It was because it seemed to be the thing that made all the separate pieces fit together. The thing that would have threaded so many individual elements of Avatar into one. The thing that would have woven a stronger narrative. Let's go back to the Crossroads of Destiny for a second. Yes, it's the moment you've all been waiting for. It's that scene.
You're the Fire Lord's son. Spreading war and violence and hatred is in your blood.
The first scene where Katara pours her heart out to the point of tears to another character, sharing with him the deepest source of her pain, the loss of her mother. The first scene where Zuko actually reaches out to someone consumed with grief and offers them his empathy and understanding. The scene where Katara admits that she's been saving her spirit water for something important, and then decides that fixing the face of her sworn enemy is, I guess, important enough to whip it out.
This is water from the spirit oasis at the North Pole. It has special properties, so I've been saving it for something important. I don't know if it would work, but...
There are quite a few blogs and metas that have gone in depth into this scene, particularly drawing visual and symbolic parallels between Crossroads of Destiny and an earlier episode in Season 2, Cave of Two Lovers. Like the colour scheme of both caves being so similar, the fact that the fated lovers, Oma and Shu, are presented as red and blue despite being earthbenders, in a show that up until now has been very careful about colour coding their benders, barring some very deliberate exceptions. The lore of Oma and Shu, the ill-fated romance between two lovers divided by war, finding a way together under a mountain. The fact that certain shots even seem to be framed the same way, with the same colours and in the same positions. And of course, the contrast between a physically intimate moment that Katara literally puts behind her once the way out is clear, versus an emotionally intimate moment in which you get the classic look over your shoulder as you walk away thing. Listen, I'm not an animation major, alright? I am nowhere near an expert on the technicalities of, filming, animation, directing techniques, anything like that. I mainly just focus on the writing. I feel like the metas I've read on this topic are pretty convincing in terms of putting forth the idea that the visual similarities between Oma and Shu and Zuko and Katara in Crossroads of Destiny are striking enough and specific enough that they were likely placed there deliberately, but I'm not an expert on this topic. So I'll leave the links in the description and I recommend you check them out for yourself and form your own opinion. That being said, I do honestly question the narrative significance of placing Zuko and Katara in a crystal cave where they have the most emotionally vulnerable moment they've ever had in the entire show. The Earth Kingdom had dungeons, like they literally threw Sokka and Toph in a prison cell in the same episode, so what exactly was the narrative purpose of putting Zuko and Katara in a cave, let alone a cave with suspiciously similar lighting and colour scheme and symbolic significance to an already established secret love cave? And if that wasn't enough, the fact that they decided to present Aang with one of his greatest internal challenges yet, the fact that Kataang was suddenly brought to a point of no return that nobody really asked for, the fact that Aang was being asked to resolve his want to pursue Katara with his need to let go of attachment to her, at the same time that Zuko and Katara are having a genuine conversation for the first time since they've met, and it also just happening to be the most emotionally intimate conversation either of them have had with anyone since the beginning of the show. Can we agree that it's a bit of an odd choice? This is the narrative's first instance of creating some form of distance or obstacle between Katara and Aang in the same moment or episode in which Zutara gains a new level of intimacy. It's the first instance in what will become a recognizable pattern in the second half of Season 3 when Zuko joins the gang. I want to know why. Why do that? Why have Aang confront the need to let go of Katara at the same time that Katara is getting emotionally intimate with Zuko? What is the point of that framing? What exactly are we supposed to infer from that juxtaposition? So far, I've talked a lot about Aang's character arc, but I think it's time we take a closer look at the other two characters in this equation. Zuko is possibly the most complex character in Avatar: The Last Airbender. He is established as the primary antagonist in Season 1, an anti-hero in Season 2, and a full-fledged hero in Season 3. Indeed, Zuko's redemption arc is still consistently praised as one of the best redemption arcs in film and television to this day. It helped that Zuko's deeply empathic and redeeming traits, as well as his overall ambivalence towards the ostentatious and destructive ideology of the Fire Nation, was foreshadowed as early as Episode 3. Zuko's path to redemption, while predictable to viewers who are paying close attention, was rife with pain and hardship. Motivated by an intense longing to be accepted and loved by his cruel and abusive father, Zuko spent 3 years searching fruitlessly for an avatar who no one had seen for over a century. Then, when Ozai decided his failure made him a national disgrace that could no longer be tolerated, Zuko and his uncle Iroh went from being banished to being fugitives. Going undercover in the Earth Kingdom, Zuko learned firsthand about the suffering that years of war and conquest had inflicted on entire towns and villages. He had to deal with abandonment, failure, isolation, ostracism, prejudice, all while struggling between the desperate yearning to reclaim his honor and return home versus the creeping realization that his true destiny might lie elsewhere. The climactic moment when Zuko confronts his father in Season 3 and commits to the destiny he will forge for himself, rather than the one thrusted upon him by years of indoctrination and abuse, is the moment where Zuko finally rejects the thing he'd been wanting to instead pursue the thing he'd been needing. He rejects the lie that the Fire Nation is inherently good, that in waging the war it had been spreading its intrinsic greatness to the world. He rejects the lie that peace, kindness, and love are weaknesses only valued by the worthless or contemptible. And he rejects the lie that his disfigurement and abuse at the hands of his father was something righteous or deserved instead of the horrendous evil that it actually was. In turning away from the Fire Nation and offering his services to Aang, Zuko finally accepts the truth. The truth that the world is in dire need of a new era of peace and harmony, that other cultures and nations hold value and deserve respect, and that the Fire Nation needs to start fighting for unity and reconciliation rather than wanton destruction and power. And a personal truth, that love, and real acceptance isn't something you buy through demonstrations of prowess or unquestioning obedience. It's something that is supposed to be unconditional, selfless, honest, and pure.
Your uncle has gotten to you, hasn't he?
Yes, he has.
Katara's arc is a little more subtle. Also a complex character, there are two main ways in which her identity and beliefs change perceptibly over the course of Avatar. At the beginning of the show, Katara has hopes and aspirations to become a fully trained waterbender, but no realistic avenue to pursue that drive. It takes many months for her to finally get her wish, and many more months before she reaches her full potential as a waterbending master. Throughout this journey, Katara learns to have confidence in herself, her capabilities and her strengths, cementing herself as possibly one of the greatest fighters in the world. In many ways, Katara's arc is also reminiscent of the typical superhero arc, a character who starts off, for the most part, already believing in the truth, whose main obstacle is overcoming doubt, particularly self-doubt, and gradually proving themselves and earning respect as they come into their own. It's almost a flat arc. Certainly if that was all there was to it, I think we could reasonably conclude it to be a flat arc, but that would ignore another way that Katara gets tested over the course of the story. The way that the narrative challenges the preconceptions she holds about her cultural identity and that of the Fire Nation, the historical enemy of her people.
It's just that for so long now, whenever I would imagine the face of the enemy, it was your face.
The latter half of Avatar, particularly the third season, really hammers home the idea that the Fire Nation doesn't necessarily equal evil, and for that matter, Water Tribe doesn't necessarily equal good. Of course, we'd met good Fire Nation characters before, like Zhong, and we'd also met some repugnant Water Tribe characters too, like Paku, before he became Woke Paku. But even though Zhong was on the good side, he still believed in the inherent destructiveness of fire and the intrinsic tranquility and purity of water.
Water brings healing and life, but fire brings only destruction and pain. It forces those of us burdened with its care to walk a razor's edge between humanity and savagery.
Zhong, a master firebender, still believed that fire's inherent nature was to hurt, where water's was to heal. This stereotype, if you will, of fire signifying wrath and vengeance at its core, fire being offensive and water being defensive, is something the show played pretty straight up until about halfway through season 2. And of all the characters, I was about to say that Katara was the most persuaded by this ideology, but I realize that's not quite accurate. It's not what I'm trying to say. It's more that the show often uses Katara as an anchor point, a vessel through which to deconstruct these themes. By challenging one character's views on who is good and who is evil, who deserves redemption and who doesn't, the show can explore these ideas in depth in a way that feels relatable and organic. And Katara is, in many ways, the perfect character to do this with. For two reasons. I think Katara is more personally attached to her cultural identity and heritage than, say, Sokka is, for example. For the longest time, she'd seen herself as the last and only surviving waterbender of her tribe, the only one able to continue the legacy of her people. Interwoven with this is that a large part of Katara's cultural identity is a connection to her mother, who herself was a victim of the Fire Nation's cruelty and ruthlessness. You may disagree with me here, but I would argue that Sokka and Toph are fighting the war more for pragmatic reasons than ideological ones. And while Aang himself certainly has a huge emotional stake in the war, having lost his entire race to the Fire Nation's brutality and rage, the show doesn't really focus on Aang's trauma nearly as much as Katara's, or at least it doesn't frame it as an integral part of his character the way it does for Katara. We do get a couple of scenes where Aang comes face to face with the horror of what the Fire Nation has done to the world and to his people specifically, but for the most part, Aang's core identity as a pacifist means that these revelations are generally resolved quickly in the same episode that they brought up, and as a whole, despite how he suffered at their hands, he never really appears to be nursing a grudge against the Fire Nation. And neither do any of the other members of the gang, from what I can tell. For Katara, though, the fight is very much a personal one.
You have no idea what this war has put me through. Me personally. The Fire Nation took my mother away from me.
Katara, like Zuko, is an idealist at heart, and the sorts of challenges she ends up facing in Season 3 really force her to confront the source of her trauma while also making her re-examine some of her core beliefs. Like the joy of finally meeting another waterbender from her tribe, only to make the bone-chilling discovery that waterbending can be just as violent and horrific as firebending, maybe even more so. Her mending her relationship with a boy whose lineage had long represented war and carnage, whose face she'd explicitly referred to as the face of the enemy. Her confronting her mother's killer and having to come to terms with her own propensity for violence and hatred in doing so. Katara's growth in Season 3 came with many emotional trials and tribulations, but also an ultimate sense of healing, as well as gaining a more nuanced perspective of the world around her. Her arc centered around themes of loss of innocence, but also forgiveness and reconciliation. In coming face to face with the source of her trauma in the Southern Raiders, Katara is finally able to heal, and in accepting that a prominent figure of the nation that tore apart her family might, despite all appearances, actually be worthy of redemption, Katara's emotional evolution comes to a poignant close. Zuko believed that his place in the world was by Ozai's side. He believed that his destiny was to capture the Avatar, and his reward and fulfillment would come from being welcomed back home as a hero of the Fire Nation, someone finally deserving of his father's love. His growth came from realizing the destructiveness of Fire Nation ideology that he could no longer justify being a part of, and that his true destiny lay in forging a new era of peace and reconciliation with the world. Katara believed, more than anyone, that the war and its proponents represented a clear moral divide between good and evil. Her growth came from coming to terms with her bitterness and trauma, the painful realization that no side is all good, just as no side is all evil, and though not everyone's character can be redeemed, true reconciliation is possible between those who put in the work to earn it. Both Zuko and Katara's maturity came with a truer and more balanced understanding of the world around them. And I have to say, there's a beautiful harmony in Zuko's illusions of Fire Nation supremacy shattering, in the same season that Katara's hatred toward Fire Nation malignance softens.
Thank you, Katara.
I think I'm the one who should be thanking you.
If I may quote from a Tumblr post that managed to put it in much better words than I ever could, My Bated Breath writes, "There's something to be said about how Katara and Zuko drive each other's characters forth, because one of my favourite parts about Katara and Zuko's relationship is how they are not dependent on each other. Their characters serve as pivotal points in each of their respective arcs because they serve as symbols and markers rather than motivators for improvement and growth themselves. It's significant that earning Katara's forgiveness was the final step of sorts in Zuko's redemption arc, and it's significant that Zuko was the one who accompanied Katara on her journey for forgiveness. From a symbolic lens, Zuko and Katara's reconciliation represents the possibility that the world, torn apart by war, can reconcile as well. They don't quite drive each other's characters by becoming an integral part of each other's motivations, but in a narrative sense, their relationship holds a lot of weight, and thus, they have a great influence on each other's characters. A romance between Zuko and Katara, revealing Aang and Katara to be false leads, would have ultimately threaded together all three of their character arcs. It would have solidified Zuko's transformation into someone who has well and truly rejected the narrow-minded, nationalistic ideals that had defined Fire Nation governance and culture for over 100 years. It would have affirmed Katara's growth, not only as someone who's managed to face her demons and conquer her traumas, but as someone who'd truly come to humanize her enemy and see the world in grayer shades than black and white. And if seen to its conclusion, it would have also rewarded her idealism, empathy, and passion by granting her a position of tremendous political power, an avenue with which to right the wrongs that had been done to her people and the rest of the world. And it would have actually delivered a payoff to the basically abandoned plotline that Aang's mastery of the Avatar state hinged upon letting go of his attachment to Katara. If it's not obvious yet, the thing that Zutara does, which Kataang cannot do, is that if Zutara had happened, the reveal that Kataang was ultimately a misdirect would still have felt earned. The Kataang scenes would still have had a purpose. In fact, you would need to explore Kataang in pretty much the same way the show already does, because you would need to set up the ship as something that Aang dearly wants, only for his growth to come from the realization that it's not what he needs. If Zutara had happened, the Kataang scenes wouldn't have been just ship baiting. They would have still contributed something meaningful to the overall story. Making Kataang canon, on the other hand, doesn't do that. Kataang doesn't grant any meaning or purpose to the Zutara scenes. It doesn't result in any kind of payoff to the ship baiting or the romantic coding that's splattered all over their most intimate moments. And that's what I hear, you know, like when Zutarians bring up all the romantic coding that's present in all the Zutara scenes, a lot of the time the counter argument is basically just, well, that's ship teasing. The creators were they were just teasing you. They were just playing with your feelings. Haha, you got suckered. That's what ship baiting is. Get over it. And you know, that all might be true. In fact, it turns out Zutara was just ship baiting in the end. But my point is, it didn't have to be. In fact, none of the shippy scenes had to be. And that's why canonizing Zutara would have made for a better story than the one that we ultimately got. A Zutara ending would have delivered a payoff to all of the characters and all of the ships. Wait, did I just say all of the ships? I haven't talked about Maiko yet, have I? Let's fix that. Let's talk about Maiko.
You're on the phone with your Your girlfriend, she's upset. She's going off about something that you said, 'cause she doesn't get your...
Need to follow your true destiny and help train the Avatar to stop your tyrannical megalomaniac father. And ultimately bring about world peace.
like I do.
Mai and Zuko have an interesting relationship, shall we say. Interesting to me because in a lot of ways, they share a dynamic which a lot of Kataangers often suggest that Zutara would have had if Zuko and Katara had actually become a canonical couple. I often hear Kataangers argue that if Zutara had been a couple, they would have been fighting constantly.
You're so impatient and hot-headed and angry.
Well, at least I feel something, as opposed to you. You have no passion for anything!
Their interest in each other would have felt incredibly superficial.
Orange is such an awful color.
You're so beautiful when you hate the world.
I don't hate you.
I don't hate you too.
They would have struggled to connect with each other on a more personal or emotional level.
I just asked if you were cold. I didn't ask for your whole life story.
And it would have basically been a roller coaster ride of breaking up and getting back together again.
It's over, Zuko. We're done.
Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with a stormy, tumultuous relationship that is filled with high levels of conflict and animosity, followed by periods of relative calm. Nor is there anything wrong with liking such a dynamic, in a fictional context at least. And there also isn't anything wrong with making such a relationship canonical within said fictional context. What makes Maiko fail for me is that Maiko is a glaring personification of Zuko's initial attachment to, and later disillusionment with, the hollow promises of Fire Nation honor and glory that he'd been searching for 3 long years. Just hear me out. The very first interaction we see between Zuko and Mai happens here in Season 3, Episode 1, The Awakening. Zuko, feeling apprehensive and uneasy about his return to the Fire Nation after years of banishment, is rather uncharacteristically willing to open up about his anxieties to the first person who asks.
It's been so long. Over 3 years since I was home. I wonder what's changed. I wonder how I've changed.
Zuko isn't usually willing to share his thoughts and feelings with people when prompted. This is definitely atypical behavior for him. I wonder if a recent experience, like someone maybe might have given him a little bit of encouragement to try this new opening up thing a little bit more. I don't know. I don't know anything. I'm just speculating. I'm not saying anything. I'm not suggesting anything. I don't know anything. Whatever the case, Zuko does open up to Mai. He's clearly still feeling conflicted about the choice he made in Crossroads of Destiny, and even though he doesn't show it, we know that deep down, the guilt of his role in Iroh's imprisonment must be weighing heavily on him. Mai responds to his quiet but obvious unease with,
I just asked if you were cold. I didn't ask for your whole life story.
You can tell by the look on Zuko's face that this was not the response he was hoping for. Mai pulls Zuko in for a kiss, like literally grabs his face and pulls him towards her, tells him not to worry, and walks away. And this is how their relationship starts. 2 things about Zuko's dynamic with Mai throughout the first half of Season 3 stand out to me. The first is that between the two of them, Zuko is the one performing nearly all of the romantic gestures. He's the one offering her compliments, trying to bring her thoughtful gifts, asking her what she would like so he can try and arrange it for her. Other than several attempts to initiate physical intimacy, Mai usually plays more of a passive role in their relationship, and more often than not, she tends to respond with apathy or even contempt to his multiple attempts to please her.
Here, this is for you.
Why would I want that?
I saw it and I thought it was pretty. Don't girls like stuff like this?
Maybe stupid girls.
How rude.
The other thing is, anytime Zuko expresses any sense of doubt or worry or agitation, Mai consistently responds in a way that usually causes Zuko to become even more withdrawn than he already was. Whether she's yawning and implying she wasn't interested in hearing it, or suggesting that he mistreats some servants to cheer himself up, or even bringing up the worst day of his life as a reminder of why he shouldn't feel bad about not being invited to the latest war meeting.
I mean, why would you even want to go? Just think about how things went at the last war meeting you went to.
Yes, that's exactly the most appalling thing you could have said.
Go ahead and compare any one of these scenes to the latest scene in Sozin's Comet, where Katara consoles Zuko over his apprehensiveness about facing Uncle Iroh. It's literally night and day.
A consistent theme of Maiko is Mai struggling to connect with Zuko, and vice versa. Unlike Zuko, Mai isn't motivated by a deep sense of morals or justice or doing right by the world. Heck, she barely even blinked when her own brother was missing and presumed to be kidnapped, and she was perfectly happy to let Azula take over the negotiation and renege on the deal. If Mai truly understood Zuko's moral code, she would never have even thought of suggesting that Zuko take out his anger on some servants in order to feel better. Mai fundamentally does not understand Zuko, his needs, or his moral compass, a fact made abundantly clear by the time they have their final confrontation at Boiling Rock.
I never wanted to hurt you, but I have to do this to save my country.
Save it? You're betraying your country.
This is also why Mai's redemption doesn't really work to salvage their relationship. Yes, I do believe that deep down, Mai does love Zuko. I honestly don't wish to deny that. I don't believe that she's an evil person at heart, but she's not an empathic person by nature, and though she ends up risking her life to save Zuko, it's not because she suddenly got a flash of insight. It's not like Zuko's words about the immorality of war finally moved her. Her actions didn't spawn from some deep moral awakening about right and wrong. She doesn't actually change. She just loves Zuko more than she fears Mai.
I guess you just don't know people as well as you think you do. You miscalculated. I love Zuko more than I fear you.
Which sounds impressive, yeah, but when you think about it, is it really an amazing development of her character? I mean, it's not like fearing Azula was ever one of her character flaws in the first place.
I have a mission, and I need you both.
Count me in. Anything to get me out of this place.
Come on, you heard Azula. We have to follow them.
She can shoot all the lightning she wants at me. I am not going in that wall sludge juice.
That is a nice trick.
Just take the bear.
To illustrate my thoughts about Maiko serving as a parallel to Zuko's emotional journey in Season 3, let's talk about Zuko's arc for a moment. In the first half of Season 3, Zuko does his best to seamlessly fit back into the world he'd been banished from for 3 years. He tries his hardest to play the role of the prodigal son. He tries to be respectful, stoic, proud. It's also noteworthy that the longer he stays in the Fire Nation, the more Zuko's demeanor towards Mai becomes notably different than the way he acted with Jin back in Ba Sing Se. He is suave, confident, even arrogant at times. Despite this veneer of aloof confidence, Zuko's inner turmoil is raging. We see him frequently visiting Iroh in the prison cells. We see him grow increasingly conflicted about the choice he made in Ba Sing Se. Internally, Zuko is struggling. He knows that he should be happy, that this should be giving him validation. He has his honor back. He has his title. He has everything he tried so hard, sacrificed so much in order to get. He's back home with a beautiful girl in his arm and an adoring crowd at his feet. And yet, he isn't happy. Zuko went back to the Fire Nation for love. Not romantic love, of course, but love and acceptance nonetheless. And at first, it seems like he has it. It seems like he has it all. And yet, he's left wanting. His father's love is dangerously conditional, and he knows it. On top of that, Zuko's experiences in the real world have forced him to grow as a person. The hollow values and ideologies of the Fire Nation don't resonate with him anymore. He tries to ignore it, he tries to conform, to play the role he'd fought tooth and nail to win back. And no matter how hard he tries, it doesn't bring him peace. No matter how much he gives, it never seems to be enough. Any happiness he gets from it is fleeting and doesn't ease his conscience. And whenever his genuine feelings do show, he can find little solace or support, not even from the one person you might expect would give it to him. I don't have any proof for this. This is my own personal speculation. But I firmly believe that when Maiko was first conceptualized, when they wrote the first episodes exploring their arc, they never quite intended for them to end up together at the end of the show. All I know is that from a thematic and character standpoint, canonizing their relationship was a bizarre choice, not just because they were incompatible, but because that incompatibility was the entire point. Maiko is inherently unfulfilling and vacuous because Zuko's salvation in the Fire Nation was inherently unfulfilling and vacuous. Maiko symbolizes Zuko's constant struggle to give and receive love in the Fire Nation, to validate his decision to come back as the triumphant prince, and his ultimate realization that no matter how hard he tries to make it work, it's just not going to. That's what Zuko's entire emotional journey in the first half of Season 3 was about. It was about hollow promises, lack of fulfillment, and disillusionment. It was about getting everything you thought you wanted and finally understanding the meaninglessness of it. And honestly, it was kind of satisfying to see. We're not supposed to be happy for Zuko that he chose to go down this path. Every time he's miserable, it's further confirmation that he made the wrong choice. We're just waiting for him to finally realize it himself. Because the truth is, if Zuko had gotten a sweet, wholesome, fulfilling love story, it would have drastically undermined the fact that his decision to return home was the worst mistake of his life. Maiko's emptiness, superficiality, and eventual breakdown are the very things that make it the perfect allegory and catalyst to Zuko's eventual detachment from Fire Nation ideology. The two of them inexplicably reuniting at the 11th hour with no attempt to resolve their ideological differences or emotional rifts is bad pacing, sure, but I'd still let it slide if that was all there was to it. What I'm not willing to let slide is the way such a resolution butchers the thematic significance Maiko had in amplifying Zuko's arc. Also, this isn't directly relevant to the point that I just made, but while we're on the topic of the canon ships, I've always felt that Kataang and Maiko, given the way they were explored in the show, far from posing as obstacles to Zutara, only served to make Zutara stand out even more. The fact that Katara is able to validate Zuko's feelings and ease his fears wouldn't have been so impactful if we didn't have such a stark contrast with the way Mai responds to similar such confessions. The fact that Zuko offers genuine empathy and understanding to Katara when she needs it wouldn't have been so meaningful if we hadn't seen Katara firmly established as that one character who gives emotional support, and rarely the one who gets to receive it. Nor would it be so significant if it weren't for the fact that he normally struggles to offer this sort of thing.
My first girlfriend turned into the moon. That's rough, buddy.
The fact that Katara opens up to Zuko in the Crystal Caves or in the Southern Raiders wouldn't have been half as meaningful if it weren't for the fact that he is the only character we ever see her be this intimate with emotionally. It's like the Iron Man and Pepper Potts thing. It's not really special in and of itself that Pepper Potts understands Iron Man, or has been there for him in his most vulnerable moments. It's only special because she's the only one who has, even before they enter a romantic relationship. The fact is, if you actually took out the Kataang and Maiko scenes, you end up weakening one of Zutara's most compelling elements. The fact that it gives the character something that no other relationship seems to do. In stories with false romantic leads, the true pairing needs to offer something more substantial or compelling in order to persuade the viewers of its legitimacy over the false pairing. Zutara would have achieved this by making the closeness of Katara's bond with Zuko all the more meaningful from the way that these two deeply emotional and empathetic characters cannot, or at least do not, ever form such a bond with anybody else in the show, least of all their canonical partners. On top of that, Zutara would have granted the bizarre pacing in Season 3 some actual significance. It would have provided narrative justification for the fact that Aang's attempts to connect with Katara in the final arc of the show only ever seemed to implode in his face and put distance between them. It would have given purpose to the fact that in the midst of these unresolved obstacles between Katara and Aang, Katara continually got closer and closer to Zuko. It would have given some meaning to the fact that after Boiling Rock, Mai isn't even mentioned until that last scene of her and Zuko together. All the strange pacing and writing decisions in the last arc of Season 3 could have actually served some purpose beyond just ship-baiting and contrived drama. It could have genuinely served as foreshadowing. But Zutara does more than that. It doesn't just fix a structural problem. It also just, coincidentally I guess, validates the arcs of all the major characters involved. And, despite the fact that Kataang and Maiko would have been revealed to be misdirects, even those reveals would still have paid off, because the misdirects would have still tied into the character arcs of Aang and Zuko. We'd finally get an ending that would have provided narrative justification to all the romance arcs, both the canon ones and the non-canon ones, and simultaneously completed the arcs of all the characters involved. Look at that, everything just tied together in a neat little bow. What better ending to a ship war could you ask for? Like seriously, what more do you need? Thematic cohesion? You realize how difficult it is to write a romance that's actually intertwined with the core themes of a non-romance genre show, right? Right? One of the weirder anti-Zutara arguments that I've seen repeated, I'm serious, I've actually seen this, it goes like this. Zuko is a Fire Nation prince, right? He's gonna be the Fire Lord, whereas Katara is literally just a peasant. And on top of that, they come from two nations that are essentially sworn enemies. How could that possibly even work? Like, in real life, such a union is incredibly unrealistic. It would probably never exist, and if it did, it will likely just catapult the world into another war. This could clearly never be canon, it's just ridiculous, girlish fantasy. Yeah, I mean, I think I speak for all of us when I say the worst thing that could possibly happen to a show about child heroes who can survive being cryogenically frozen for 100 years, and who also have the ability to channel the elements of the earth and sky, single-handedly bringing a 100-year-long fascist regime to its knees with thanks to the well-timed spiritual advice of a giant telepathic lion turtle. You know, the last thing you want in a story like that is for the romantic subplots to feel historically inaccurate and shatter your sense of immersion reality, you know what I mean? This reminds me of when my dad watched the Jungle Book remake and spent about 20 minutes complaining about the fact that Disney put rhinos in India. Like, the talking animals were totally fine, the giant prehistoric gorilla, that was totally fine. But excuse me, rhinos in India?
Oh my god, what is that? Oh my god! What is that?
Whatever. I also want to mention that there is a sister argument to the Zutara would have been logically/historically inaccurate claim, and it goes like this. Avatar is, at the end of the day, a kids' show. Kids' shows don't tend to be all that complicated. They tend to have fairly obvious and predictable tropes, and Kataang fits a lot of those tropes quite neatly, where Zutara doesn't, so kind of unreasonable to expect that Zutara should be canon instead of Kataang. Now, I'm not someone who thinks that subversion is like the greatest, most bedazzling literary tool in existence that you can just wave like a magic wand and it will improve everything you're writing, but I also don't believe that subversion is inherently bad. I think that all depends on the context. And to that end, I have to say I completely disagree with the Zutara would have been too subversive for a kids' show argument. To start with, I don't think something being defined squarely as children's literature, or media that is primarily marketed to children, precludes it in any way from being subversive. In fact, Avatar itself has a precedent of subverting tropes that you'd normally expect to be played straight in a show geared to such a young audience. It has the "my parents aren't evil, but they just don't understand me and refuse to accept my goals/choices/identity," but unlike pretty much every other children's movie that explores this trope, it doesn't end with the parents realizing their errors in judgment and reconciling with their wayward child. It has the "king's secret advisor is evil and it's up to the kids to expose him and bring him down" trope, except deposing Longfeng didn't end up stripping him of his political power, and at the end of the day, the meddling kids were no match against Varys and Littlefinger. It has the "I need to go on a journey to exact justice on the villain who wronged me" arc, and while it doesn't ultimately culminate in revenge, it also doesn't affirm the "true emotional closure can only come from forgiveness" idea, itself a very common aesop of revenge arcs in children's literature. Here's what I think about the limits of artistic license or subversive storytelling or defying narrative conventions or what have you. Tropes are tools, and good writing will use whichever tools in whatever way will serve the story best. That's why there's no such thing as a good trope or a bad trope. What matters more is thematic cohesion. To bring this back to romance in particular, you'll notice that in a lot of romance media, that is exactly what happens. The most popular and enduring love stories of all time tend to be ones which succeed in embedding their romance arcs, as fanciful or unrealistic as they may be, with thematic significance. A tragic love story between a high-class socialite and a destitute orphan, set against the backdrop of a real-life tragedy that explores the impacts of class division, economic privilege, social mobility, of finding a will to survive and continue on in the face of immense grief and loss. A bittersweet tale of a jaded barkeep who is forced to confront his apathy and cynicism when an old flame walks into his cafe in desperate need of his help, set in the same year a reluctant United States found itself unwillingly dragged into the throes of the Second World War. A love story between two soulmates from strikingly different backgrounds, whose spiritual connection transcends distance, time, and memory, in a story where ancient tradition comes into conflict with modernity, where nostalgic yearning meets new beginnings, where destinies collide as a cosmic event is about to... I'll probably spoil too much if I finish that sentence, but I think you get the gist. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't believe that most viewers will be actively aware of these sorts of parallels when they're watching these movies. But I'd still argue that just because you don't notice the impact doesn't mean it's not there. I think most people would agree that if you were to rewrite Titanic such that Jack and Rose were of the same social class, for example, yeah, you'd probably get a more realistic love story, I'll give you that. But it would come at the expense of stripping away an enormous amount of symbolism, metaphor, and theme at the heart of the movie. And somehow I don't think it would make for a better story. My point is, generally speaking, romantic subplots that are carefully interwoven with the core themes of their overarching narratives will always feel more cohesive and resonant with the audience than ones that aren't. External consistency isn't nearly as important as internal consistency, Because at the end of the day, stories are written for emotional engagement, not hyperrealism or genre compliance. So, with that all being said, what are the themes of Avatar?
The greatest illusion of this world is the illusion of separation. Things you think are separate and different are actually one and the same.
Like the Four Nations.
Yes, we are all one people, but we live as if divided.
I mentioned this before when I was talking about Katara's arc, but for a show aimed at kids, Avatar definitely manages to add nuance and complexity to the story's core struggle between good and evil, ultimately affirming that every side has its goods and bads. No single nation or core philosophy holds the perfect view on things. It's a lesson that almost every character ends up having to reconcile in one way or another. In fact, one of the central ideas that is explicitly stated in the show is the theme of learning and incorporating from other elements in order to gain a richer and more enlightened perspective.
It is important to draw wisdom from many different places. If we take it from only one place, it becomes rigid and stale. Understanding others, the other elements, and the other nations will help you become whole.
Over and over again, pride, inflexibility, or just over-dependence on your natural element is consistently portrayed as a flaw, something that will leave you weak and vulnerable. On the other hand, the ability to learn from opposing philosophies, to assimilate wisdom from multiple sources, even those that run counter to your own core beliefs, is, while challenging, consistently portrayed as the real source of strength and power and righteousness. In a way, it's possible to view the entire war in this light, the fight and ultimate victory over the one nation taking far too much stock in its national superiority and worth. Nationalism and imperialism bad, diversity and equality good. Something we can all learn from, I think. We also have some very strong themes of reconciliation, atonement, and forgiveness running through the entire series, particularly the story of new generations having to bear the burden of confronting or undoing their ancestors' mistakes. Whether it's Aang who has to make up for Roku's negligence, or Zuko who needs to bring honor and peace back to the Fire Nation, or even Katara who ends up openly defying a culture steeped in sexism and discrimination. In the fight to make the world a better place, our heroes frequently end up in direct opposition to regressive and harmful traditions in the world of Avatar. And in doing so, we're shown over and over again that through courage, determination, and moral integrity, it is in fact possible to successfully challenge years of cultural dogma and ignorance, to right the wrongs of the past, and ultimately work towards a more progressive future of equality, justice, and peace.
The road ahead of us is challenging. 100 years of fighting has left the world scarred and divided. But with the Avatar's help, we can get it back on the right path and begin a new era of love and peace.
The last major theme I want to comment on is the theme of destiny versus free will that many characters in the show ultimately struggle with. Aang's destiny is explicitly laid out at the beginning of the series, being the only one who has the power to bring peace to the world, yet he struggles with self-doubt and often fears he won't have what it takes to defeat Ozai. In the final arc of the show, a new dilemma emerges for Aang, whether he can actually bring himself to kill Ozai, something everyone and their mother is telling Aang to do, but something Aang, who's basically a pacifist monk, feels deeply opposed to. Zuko's entire character arc is basically driven by an internal battle of wills, as he struggles to reconcile the destiny his father has thrust upon him with his true self, the part of him that cares about people's lives and their well-being, the part that knows, deep down, what he's doing isn't what he's meant to be doing.
It's time for you to look inward and begin asking yourself the big questions. Who are you? And what do you want?
We also have Katara, someone who begins the show with very few prospects of ever becoming a master bender, who is literally told to abandon all hope of being a warrior because of her gender, who refuses to accept defeat or give up, and ends up being one of the most powerful benders we've ever seen on the show. Even Toph and Sokka have their moments where they ultimately create their own paths and carve their own legacies in defiance of what is expected of them. And of course, as we all know, Zuko ends up redeeming himself, and Aang ends up proving that not only can he defeat the Fire Lord, but he can do it without taking life. I know there's especially recently been a lot of debate over Aang's choice to spare Ozai, and this might run counter to what some Zutarians think on this matter, but I personally don't have a problem with Aang ultimately showing mercy, because to me it actually does validate the overall theme of not being a slave to fate, if you know what I mean. I just don't like the way they ultimately got there, but that's a topic for another video. What I'm trying to say is, one of the most powerful and repeated themes of the show is the idea that it is you who is the ultimate master of your fate, and that with enough courage and hard work, you can make anything happen. You can forge your own destiny. It's because of all this that when people point out the barriers to a realistic romance between Zuko and Katara with regards to their differences in social class or their ethnic backgrounds or the history of war and conflict between their two nations, I can't help being like, yeah, that's kind of the point. Avatar: The Last Airbender is a coming-of-age story. It's a story centered around the efforts of new generations trying to cling to hope as they struggle to undo the wrongs of the generations that came before them. It's a story of a world that's been torn apart by hyper-nationalism and imperialism. A story where the fate of humanity depends desperately on the construction of a new world order of peace and harmony. It's a story where wisdom and enlightenment is attained through challenging cultural dogmas rather than clinging to them, where destinies can be forged through individual determination and willpower, and where one of the key lessons to be learned is that no single cultural philosophy is inherently strong or weak, intrinsically good or bad, but that enrichment comes from learning and adapting and integrating the strengths of multiple sources of wisdom, even and especially ones which are canonically emphasized as polar opposites. In light of all this, I have to ask, how much more setup do you actually need? How much more context do you need to lay the groundwork for a romance in which a Fire Nation prince finds common ground with and eventually falls for the daughter of a Southern Water Tribe chief? The fact that they come from warring sides, their subsequent marriage signifying the end of an era of hate and division and the dawning of a new era of harmony and reconciliation, at a time when sweeping political and cultural reforms is something that the Fire Nation is in desperate need of by the end of the show. The ultimate story of an extraordinary union of two powerfully driven individuals openly challenging hundreds of years of cultural ignorance and dogma and prejudice. Seriously, what more do you want? In-universe lore that literally tells an ancient story of forbidden lovers separated by war where, just in case the parallels weren't obvious enough, they freaking color-coded it for you? Sorry, got a little bit overexcited. Honestly, when people argue that Zutarians only ship Zutara because of the forgiving hug scene or like Southern Raiders or, I don't know, the fact that he saved her from lightning or whatever, like, okay, you know what? Yeah, sure, maybe some do. Like, I can't speak for everyone. But for me, personally, if you wanted me to stop shipping Zutara, you'd have to take out way more of the show than those scenes. Starting with this, and this, and this, and this, and this. Alright. I'm trying to channel my inner Lindsay Ellis, because, you know, like, she's usually drinking in her videos, except I don't really drink, so I wanted to say, like, in case it wasn't clear, I don't hate Avatar, and I definitely don't hate Aang or Mai. I made this video for a couple of reasons. A big reason I went and made this video is that I've seen a lot of Kataangers say something along the lines of, you know, I don't understand Zutara, I don't understand the appeal, I just don't get it, I don't see how they could have worked canonically. And I could see that a good portion of those comments were actually genuine, you know, like coming from a place of good faith. So I thought, hey, why not? But I have to say this video is a little bit personal to me because I can pretty definitively say that Avatar: The Last Airbender and Zutara was kind of like a tipping point for me as a film buff or movie viewer or whatever. I was about 14 when I saw the show for the first time, and at the time, things like theme, character arcs, metaphors, whatever. They were all just boring literary concepts that you had to write about in essays at school. And you know how the books you read at school are always like really old and dry and just nothing you can personally relate to. Like, they're not fun to pick apart and analyze, you know what I mean? Like, I don't think I can remember a single essay in school where I actually can say, I actually had fun writing this thing. And so for a long time, I genuinely thought that literary analysis was just boring. Like, that's what it was, just difficult, boring stuff. I wasn't interested in exploring parallels between characters or picking apart broad thematic statements that might be hidden within the text. And I genuinely didn't think I ever would be. And it was literally Zutara that changed my mind on all this, because Avatar The Last Airbender was the first time that I watched a show where I actually found myself disagreeing with the creator on something. Like, prior to that, I'd seen movies that I didn't like and read books that I didn't enjoy, but I genuinely thought that it was just a matter of taste, whether you liked something or not, you know, like Flavors of a Bubba or something like that. This one's mango. It's really good. But Avatar was the first time where I actually felt like there was something deeply flawed about the ending, and it's not just to do with the shipping stuff, though that is a part of it, but like, it wasn't just a matter of taste this time. There was actually something technical and objective about it. There are actually key components of literature that I could identify this time as being poorly executed. And that was the moment where I became a much more critical viewer. Like, I actually started paying attention to things. I stopped taking things at face value. And I got significantly better at predicting twists, you know, even if I didn't know there was one. The emotional journey of following this couple and the disappointment when all the pieces that seemed to be lining up never ended up going anywhere kind of served as my spiritual awakening, shall we say. So me going back to this show, you know, going back to the thing that started it all, it's kind of like me going back to my roots. This show and the Zutara ship will always have a special place in my heart for teaching me to love literature and find passion and joy in critiquing it. So I tried to keep this video focused on like the ways in which Zutara being canonical would have provided a more thematically consistent and compelling and cohesive narrative. And I also provided like a few rebuttals that I felt like really needed to be said, but otherwise, like, I tried to keep it as objective as I could, and I know there's still tons of stuff that I didn't get a chance to touch on. One particular topic that I wanted to get into was how like the bending philosophies and the elements, you know, actually played into Zuko and Katara's internal struggles and like the ways in which they mirror each other. But like, I feel like in order to really do justice to that particular topic, I'm probably going to have to make it its own video. So I don't know, let me know if you're interested in that sort of thing, and maybe I'll chuck in another video or two on this. Honestly, the biggest thing that just really upsets me about Zuko and Katara not getting together is just the sheer amount of wasted potential. Like, I have a huge soft spot for enemies to lovers stories. Like, I'll admit that as a fact. But even then, I'm not much of a shipper. Like, I rarely ship. And this might just be me, you know, like, I know there's a lot of diehard fanon shippers out there in the Zutara fandom, but whenever I've shipped a couple, it's always been a canon ship. Like, every time, you know, I'm not usually, I'm not the kind of person to just ship stuff for no reason, you know, like, I don't do that. And Zutara is literally the only exception. Like, this is the only ship I've ever cared about that wasn't a canon ship. And I think a big part of it is that I just genuinely felt like it should have been. And even then, you know, like, at the time when I finished the show, I mean, I was disappointed, yeah, but I didn't think I would stay disappointed. I remember thinking at the time, like, okay, yeah, this is frustrating, but like, hey, you know, I'm gonna see other movies, I'm gonna watch other shows. Like, yeah, so far Zutara has been the first and only ship I've seen to interweave character arcs, themes, symbolism, parallels, lore, and it just happens to be my bread and butter, like enemies to lovers, while simultaneously intertwining with a larger story that's not just about romance. But fuck, like, I'm gonna see other movies, I'm gonna watch other shows. Surely there's gonna be another Zutara out there somewhere, right? One that's canon this time?
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine, but you just can't get into it because they would never understand.
Look, I don't know if I'm just looking in the wrong places. Like, I mean, I admit I'm not a romance fan, you know, I don't tend to go out of my way to consume romance media. But at the same time, that was kind of what I liked about Zutara. I liked the fact that it was a romance that, you know, wasn't the main story, but still tied in so many elements from the main story. I've honestly never managed to find another romantic subplot that's managed to do that to that extent. A Zutara ending would have paid off so many different structural and thematic components of the story. It would have resolved plot threads and completed character arcs. It would have answered questions which were initially set up to be major dilemmas only to lead nowhere. Zutara would have been like the final synchronized kick in Inception, you know, reverberating through all the different levels and giving 5 new layers of meaning to the show. Like, I know it sounds crazy, but I genuinely think that this ship could have been something really special, not just in Avatar, but in animation and storytelling as a whole. And I can't help seeing it as such a shame that so much potential was never realized on screen. Like I said in my previous video, if a season 4 wasn't possible for Avatar, then I understand that having Zuko and Katara kiss in the finale would probably feel rather rushed, you know, even with the way things were going in Sozin's Comet. I do stand by what I said before, that, you know, I would have been fine with just a suggestion that they were going to get together eventually, and, you know, like basically a confirmation that the chemistry between them was romantically charged. Like, in my opinion, even if it's not as conclusive or flashy as a big damn kiss, just the reveal that the seeds which had been sown to lay the foundation for their relationship actually held real meaning and significance beyond just ship baiting would have still felt incredibly powerful and resonant. There is one point that I'll concede to the Kataangers or the anti-Zutarians or whatever, and it's that at the end of the day, Zuko and Katara never explicitly showed any feelings for each other on screen. And yeah, I fully acknowledge that this is a problem, you know? I mean, actually, if you haven't noticed, this is my 2-hour video explaining why I think it's a problem. Why they should have shown some feelings for each other. Why it would have felt resonant and meaningful if they'd shown some feelings for each other. By the time the show ended, Zuko and Katara pretty much had everything else going for them. Like, all the ducks were in a row. Character arcs, theme, lore, symbolism, trust, intimacy, like everything was there. The only thing that the ship lacked was canonicity. There's an oft-repeated debate among the shippers and non-shippers in the fandom over how much, if any, of the layers and layers of meaning Canon Zutara would have had were ever actually placed there with authorial intent. How much, if any of it, was ever deliberately crafted and inserted by the writers, the animators, or the directors who worked on the show. How much of it is just fandom drawing connections where none were ever intended. A depressingly large portion of shipping discourse is allocated to the subject of authorial intent and what might be considered evidence of it. Finding said evidence, cherry-picking it, rebutting it, denying it, calling shippers and anti-shippers delusional over it, and so on and so on. If this comment section turns out to be no different, then I'd be disappointed, but I can't say I'd be surprised. I'd say I'd take a shot every time I got such a comment, but, you know. In response to the comments that I will inevitably get, asking me to justify my opinions on Zutara in spite of this quote, or that comment, or this interview, or whatever is people's go-to trump card on authorial intent these days, allow me to tell you a little story. Some of you may already know this story. It's the story of one man, a mathematician, computer scientist, cryptanalyst, logician, philosopher, a man whose work in cracking the German Enigma code in the Second World War is estimated to have saved no less than 14 million lives. A man who was arrested and prosecuted and forced to undergo chemical castration because he was a homosexual at a time when homosexuality was a criminal offence. A man who, only 2 years after his trial and conviction, took his own life at the age of 42 by eating an apple he'd laced with cyanide. A man named Alan Turing, whose shadow as the architect of modern computer science and artificial intelligence looms over every tablet, every smartphone, every laptop and computer we use today. His legacy in computer programming and the intriguing details surrounding his tragic death have spawned many a rumor and urban legend. One particularly salient tale is the story that the Apple logo and brand, the graphic of an apple with a bite taken out of it, was specifically chosen as a tribute to Alan Turing's life and legacy. It was a compelling and poignant narrative, one that resonated with so many who heard it. The iconic logo serving as a timeless memorial to a brilliant mind, a humble token of gratitude and honor, recognizable to anyone who knew his story. In the early 2000s, Steve Jobs was directly asked to confirm the authenticity of the pervasive origin story. Had the logo indeed been designed, as so many believed it to be, as a meaningful and touching homage to the founding father of the modern computer? Steve answered with genuine regret. It's not true. But God, we wish it were. As do I, Steve. As do I.
What you say? That you only meant well, 'cause you did, what you say, that it's all for the best, 'cause it is, what what you say. And it's just what we need. You decided this. What you say. That you only meant well, 'cause you did. What you say. That it's all what you say. That you only meant well, 'cause you did. What you say. That it's all for the best, 'cause it is what you say. And it's just what we need. You decided this. What you say. What did she say? Rinse and notes keep falling out your mouth. It's sweet talk newspaper.
Hey guys, future me here. So I just want to add a couple of things real quick before we wrap up. For those of you who completed the survey in my last video, like after it came out, I do have some updated results, which I'll try to post into a Google Doc that I'll put in the description. So like, hopefully that'll be ready by the time this video comes out. All right. Fingers crossed. It'll probably be the last and only update that I do on the survey. I just thought maybe some of you might be interested. Second thing is, I do have a bit of bonus footage for those of you who've stayed until now. This is actually my third time recording this video. God, don't even ask. Long story short, I literally bought like a brand new camera from Amazon. It was meant to be like high quality, 4K, HD, whatever. It was to try and like, you know, give you some higher quality footage, right? And basically it was a mistake. So I ended up actually just using my husband's phone, which was somehow better. Anyway, halfway through the first recording, I actually called my mum because when I was doing research for this video, she joined in with me and my brother on like the last 4 or 5 episodes, right? And she is not an Avatar fan by any means. So like watching the finale with me and my brother, that was pretty much her only real exposure to the show. So she wasn't watching with like any shipping goggles or anything like that. And she was genuinely shocked when Zuko ended up with Mai and Katara with Aang, because she honestly thought that the finale was setting up Zuko and Katara to be a couple. She legit actually got mad at me for showing her the show because she was like, why are you showing me this thing that, in her words, doesn't make any sense? Anyway, so I ended up calling her like in the middle of my video, and I thought it'd be kind of funny to like get her insight and everything. And I was gonna put it like in the middle of my, you know, the lightning scene is clearly ship baiting rant. But when I was editing it, I realized it kind of broke the flow, and then I ended up re-recording the whole bloody thing anyway, so here it is at the very end for you guys. For all you loyal viewers who've stayed until now, I'm genuinely sorry for the poor video and audio quality that you're about to experience. Like, your eyes and ears will bleed. I apologize. I hope it's still worth it. Important disclaimer, since watching the show, or the finale of the show with me, she had seen my Zutara versus Kataang video that I posted last year, so that may have influenced some of the opinions which you'll hear her express. But I promise I didn't get her to rehearse anything. Like, I did warn her that I was going to call her and ask her about Avatar and stuff, and obviously I got her permission to put her on YouTube, but I never actually told her what I was going to ask, so this is all her, alright? Anyway, enjoy. Hey Mom! Happy New Year to you too. You know when we were watching Avatar last year, and like, do you remember what you said about like how it ended with Zuko and Katara and like Mai and Zuko or whatever?
I don't know. It's just like the beginning and the ending doesn't match. it's like I know, the writer tired of writing it and just finished it off quickly. Go to the party. And try to pen a lion picture. And then in the end he ran out of energy, so he put duck towers. We're watching it and we see like the tension building up between the two characters.
Yeah.
So nice, and everyone watching it, and we think something may happen between those two characters, and somehow the writer changed his mind, changed his ideas, and pull those two characters apart and put someone else in it. It's like unexpected. And for me, I don't think it makes sense.
Yeah.
I wish that it would happen. Because I know that the people they are completely different. But because they are different, they attract each other more. So So in the real life, yes, a thing like that is like a couple like that or the laugh like that is so hard and so I think it's so rare. But once you can maintain it, it makes sense and it's make I don't know. Life is so much more colorful than the one which is like a okay, peaceful here, peaceful there, perfectly match. That's it. Life like that is so boring. There have to be like, life have to be fire, sometimes water, yeah, sometimes wind, yeah. And when you got a mix of everything, life would be really like natural.
I should just end my recording. I should just have you take over. This is great. See you next time on Sneezy Reviews. That was a great ending.
Thank you. Goodbye now. Goodbye. Goodbye. Thank you. Goodbye.
I just wanted to be funny. Is that so wrong?